On a gray morning in the autumn of 9/11, a giant knelt. The man was enormous even by the standards of his own people, a full head taller than the tallest Frankish nobleman present, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway and hands that had gripped the helms of longships in North Atlantic storms. His hair was the color of dirty flax pulled back from a face weathered by salt wind and decades of open water crossings. He was somewhere past 50 years old, ancient by the reckoning of his age, and the knees he lowered to the flagstones had carried him across oceans, up the banks of rivers from Northumbria to the Loire, and through the gates of cities he had burned to the ground. He knelt now in a small stone church near the river Epte, and a Frankish bishop poured holy water over his bowed head, and the warriors watching from the shadows, Norse and Frankish alike, understood that the world was bending on its hinge. His name was Rollo, or Hrolf, or Rolf. The sources cannot agree, and neither could the men who knew him. What every source does agree on is this: the man kneeling in that church had spent the previous 3 decades terrorizing the richest kingdom in Christendom. He had sailed his longships up the Seine to the very walls of Paris. He had burned monasteries so thoroughly that the only record of their existence is the smoke-stained margins of chronicles written by monks who escaped. He had extracted silver from Frankish kings the way a farmer extracts milk from a cow, regularly, efficiently, and with the calm expectation that there would always be more. And now he was being handed a duchy. Not conquered, not seized, handed. The king of the Franks, a man history remembers by the unfortunate but accurate name Charles the Simple, had looked at the smoldering wreckage of his northern provinces and arrived at a conclusion that was either desperate genius or spectacular surrender. Give the Viking what he wants. Give him the land. Give him the rivers and the harbors and the fields and the towns. Let him have it. Let him call it his own, and pray to whatever God still listens that he defends it against the next wave of raiders instead of leading them. The territory Rollo received that day would become Normandy, literally, the land of the Northmen. Within 5 generations, his descendants would conquer England, establish kingdoms in Sicily and southern Italy, lead armies in the Crusades, reshape the legal and linguistic fabric of the British Isles, and build a political legacy that echoes in courtrooms and parliaments to this day. The man kneeling in that church had no way of knowing any of this. He was a raider who had taken a land deal. He was an aging warrior trading his sword for a title and his longship for a stone hall. He thought he was securing his retirement. What he was actually doing was accidentally constructing the foundations of modern Europe. This is the story of how that happened. The account of Rollo's life and the founding of Normandy reaches us through a handful of medieval sources, each imperfect, each invaluable. The most detailed is the work of Dudo of Saint-Quentin, a Frankish cleric commissioned around the year 996 by Rollo's grandson, Duke Richard I of Normandy, to write the official history of the Norman dukes. Dudo spent years at the Norman court, interviewing elderly men who claimed to remember Rollo, collecting family oral traditions, and composing a Latin chronicle that is equal parts history, propaganda, and poetry. Modern historians treat Dudo with caution. He wrote to glorify his patrons, and his tendency to dress Norse pagans in the rhetorical clothing of Roman heroes makes certain passages nearly useless as factual record. But Dudo had access to living memory. He spoke with people whose grandparents had sailed with Rollo, and his chronicle preserves details that survive nowhere else. Beyond Dudo, we have Flodard of Reims, a meticulous Frankish annalist writing in the mid-10th century, whose dry year-by-year entries provide the closest thing to objective chronology available for this period. There is Richer of Reims, who expanded on Flodard's work with additional detail, and the anonymous author of the Planctus for the destruction of the monastery at Jumièges, whose anguished Latin verse captures what it felt like to watch a Viking fleet appear around a bend in the river. From the Norse side, we have fragments. The Icelandic sagas, particularly the Orkneyinga saga and Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla, written 3 centuries after Rollo's time, but drawing on older oral traditions that preserve the Norse perspective on a man the Franks remembered as a destroyer and the Normans would come to revere as a founder. Together, these sources allow us to reconstruct imperfectly but powerfully the arc of a man who began as one raider among many and ended as the progenitor of a dynasty that would transform the medieval world. To understand Rollo, you must first understand the world that created him. And that world was Scandinavia in the second half of the 9th century. A landscape so harsh, so magnificent, and so utterly indifferent to human comfort that it produced a culture defined by the twin imperatives of survival and expansion. The fjords of western Norway carved into the mountains like the blade strokes of a god who had tired of flat land. Sheer granite walls rose thousands of feet from black water so deep that the sun never reached its bottom. In winter, which lasted from October to April and sometimes longer, the darkness was almost total. The sun crawled along the southern horizon for a few pale hours and then sank, leaving the settlements in a cold that crept into the bones and stayed there. The forests were thick with spruce and pine, the soil thin and acidic, fit for grazing small herds of sheep and goats but hostile to the plow. What farmland existed clung to narrow strips along the fjord edges, and every generation as families grew and sons multiplied, the strips grew narrower still. This was the fundamental engine of the Viking Age, and it was not romance, not wanderlust, not some innate Norse love of battle. Though all of those elements were present and real, it was arable land. There was not enough of it. Norway's geography was spectacular and merciless, and by the middle of the 8th century, the population had grown beyond what the fjords could sustain. The eldest son inherited the farm. The second son might find a wife with land of her own. The third son and the fourth and the fifth, they had 2 options: accept a life of permanent subordination, working as laborers on their brother's farm, or get on a boat. They got on boats. The Norse shipbuilding tradition was, by the 9th century, the most advanced seafaring technology on the planet. The longship, sleek, shallow-drafted, clinker-built with overlapping oak planks riveted together and caulked with animal hair soaked in pine tar, was a masterpiece of engineering that could cross the open Atlantic, navigate rivers barely deeper than a man's waist, and beach on any shoreline in minutes. A single longship could carry between 30 and 60 warriors and their supplies. It could be rowed in dead calm and sailed in open ocean. It was, in every meaningful sense, the weapon that made the Viking Age possible. Without the longship, the Norse were farmers trapped between mountains and sea. With it, they were the most mobile military force in the Western world. Into this world, sometime around the year 860, the exact date is uncertain, as are most biographical details before his arrival in Francia, a boy was born who would be known as Hrolf. The name meant something like famous wolf in Old Norse, which suggests either prophetic parents or more likely a culture that named its children the way it built its ship, with functional ambition and an eye toward what they might need to become. Dudo of Saint-Quentin, our most detailed source, claims that Rollo was the son of a powerful Norse jarl, a regional chieftain, and that his family held lands in what is now the region around Mora of Romsdal on the western coast of Norway. Snorri Sturluson, writing in Iceland 300 years later, identifies him as Hrolf the Walker, called so because he was too large for any horse to carry and was forced to go everywhere on foot. This detail has the texture of legend, but it tells us something the sagas consistently confirm. Rollo was physically extraordinary. In a culture that valued size, strength, and the capacity for violence as practical survival attributes, he was exceptional enough that his body itself became part of his story. His father, if Dudo is to be believed, was a man of considerable local authority who held his position through the usual Norse combination of military prowess, strategic marriage, and the ability to keep his oath-sworn warriors fed, armed, and loyal. Norse society in this period was not the anarchic wilderness that later Christian chroniclers would portray. It had structure, complex, flexible, and profoundly personal. A jarl's power rested on his reputation, which rested on his generosity, which rested on his ability to acquire wealth through trade, tribute, or raiding. Loyalty flowed upward as long as silver flowed downward. When the silver stopped, the loyalty evaporated, often violently. Rollo's mother is a shadow in the sources. Dudo mentions her only in passing, which by the conventions of medieval historiography means she was either socially insignificant or so thoroughly respectable that she offered nothing dramatic to narrate. What we can infer from the broader cultural context is that she raised her son in a household where the line between nobility and piracy was invisible, because in 9th century Scandinavia, that line did not exist. A jarl's hall was both a manor house and a military headquarters. The same men who plowed the fields in spring rowed the long ships in summer. The same hands that delivered lambs in March gripped sword hilts in July. There was no contradiction. This was simply how life worked when the land could not feed everyone and the sea offered everything the land withheld. The boy Hrolf grew up in this hall, absorbing two educations simultaneously. The first was physical: seamanship, weapons handling, navigation by stars and current, and the flight patterns of birds, the reading of wind and wave that separated a competent sailor from a dead one. By the time a Norse boy reached his early teens, he could handle an oar in heavy swells, read a coastline from miles offshore, and fight with sword, axe, and spear well enough to survive his first raid. The second education was political. He learned how alliances were made and unmade, how blood feuds could be resolved through negotiation or escalated through retribution, how a leader maintained the loyalty of men who were nominally his equals and perfectly willing to replace him if his judgment faltered. He learned that the most dangerous moment in a Norse chieftain's life was not combat. It was the moment after combat, when the plunder had to be divided and every warrior watched to see if the distribution was fair. This was the forge, not the romanticized Viking of modern imagination, the horned, helmeted berserker howling at the moon. The real forge was subtler and harder. It was a world that demanded simultaneous excellence in violence, navigation, diplomacy, and resource management. And it killed the men who could not deliver all four, the ones who survived, the ones who accumulated followers and reputation, and the silver to fund further expeditions were not merely strong, they were intelligent, adaptable, and ruthlessly pragmatic. They understood that the axe and the handshake were instruments to be employed as circumstances required, and that the man who relied exclusively on either would not last long. Hrolf was apparently very good at all of it. By his late teens or early 20s, the timeline here is frustratingly vague, he had gathered a war band of his own and was raiding along the coastlines of the North Sea. But then something happened that would redirect his life entirely. The sources disagree on the details, but the broad shape of the story is consistent. Rollo was banished. Dudo claims it was a political exile, the result of a conflict with the Norwegian king, possibly Harald Fairhair, the semi-legendary ruler who was in the process of unifying Norway under a single crown for the first time. Snorri Sturluson offers a more specific version. Rollo raided cattle within Norway itself, violating the taboo against plundering one's own people, and Harald Fairhair pronounced a sentence of outlawry. In Norse legal terms, this was a kind of civil death. An outlaw had no legal protection, no right to shelter, no claim on anyone's loyalty. He could be killed by anyone without consequence. His property was forfeit. His family could shelter him at their own legal peril. Whether the exile was political, legal, or some combination, whether it was even real or a narrative invention to explain why Rollo left Norway, the consequence was the same. A man in his physical prime, with a loyal warband, proven maritime skills, and no future in his homeland, pointed his longships south and never returned. The fjords had produced him. They would not hold him. The narrowing strips of farmland, the harsh politics of a consolidating kingdom, the fundamental arithmetic of too many sons and too little soil, all of it conspired to send Hrolf into the wider world. He would not be the first. He would not be the last, but he would be the one who mattered most. The world Rollo sailed into was fracturing. The empire that Charlemagne had built, feasted the greatest political achievement in Western Europe since Rome, was tearing itself apart. Charlemagne had united the Franks, conquered the Saxons, absorbed Bavaria, subdued the Lombards, and created a single Christian realm stretching from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, from the North Sea to central Italy. When he died in 814, he left this vast territory to his sole surviving son, Louis the Pious, who spent his entire reign trying to hold it together and failed. Louis's 3 sons fought a civil war that culminated in the Treaty of Verdun in 843, which split the empire into 3 kingdoms. The western portion, roughly corresponding to modern France, went to Charles the Bald. The eastern portion, roughly corresponding to modern Germany, went to Louis the German. The middle strip, a long, thin, indefensible corridor from the North Sea to Italy, went to Lothair and would be fought over by the other 2 kingdoms and their successors for the next 1,000 years. This was the political landscape of the late 9th century, a divided Frankish world ruled by squabbling kings whose authority rarely extended much beyond the reach of their household cavalry. The great nobility, the counts and dukes who theoretically served the crown, were increasingly autonomous, building private armies, constructing castles, and treating their territories as personal possessions rather than royal grants. The church, which had served as Charlemagne's administrative backbone, was wealthy but militarily weak. Its monasteries and cathedrals packed with gold and silver and staffed by men who had taken vows against violence. The peasantry worked the land, paid their taxes, and prayed that the latest political crisis would resolve itself without an army marching through their fields. Into this landscape of wealth, division, and military weakness, the longships came. The Viking raids on Francia had begun in earnest in the 840s and escalated with terrifying consistency through the following decades. The pattern was brutally simple. In spring, when the seas calmed and the rivers swelled with snowmelt, fleets of longships would appear at the mouths of the great rivers, the Seine, the Loire, the Garonne, the Somme, and row upstream into the heartland. The shallow draft of the longships meant they could penetrate hundreds of miles inland, reaching towns and monasteries that had never considered themselves coastal targets. The raiders would strike, plunder everything portable, gold, silver, livestock, slaves, and withdraw to their ships before any Frankish army could assemble. If a local force did confront them, the Vikings simply rowed to the other bank, or retreated downstream, or regrouped and attacked somewhere else. They were water. The Frankish defenses were stone, and water, given time, always finds its way around stone. The monasteries suffered worst. They were the banks of the early medieval world, repositories of accumulated wealth in the form of jeweled reliquaries, golden altar vessels, embroidered vestments, and the silver coins that pilgrims deposited as offerings. They were also by design located in accessible positions along rivers and coasts, the better to receive pilgrims, the worse for resisting pirates. The great monasteries of northern Francia, Saint-Wandrille, Jumièges, Fontenelle, Saint-Denis, were raided repeatedly, stripped of their treasures, and in some cases burned so completely that their monks scattered across the countryside, carrying whatever manuscripts they could save and abandoning libraries that had taken centuries to assemble. The anonymous monk who composed the Planctus for the destruction of Jumièges captured the experience in Latin verse that still carries the rawness of lived terror. He described the smoke rising from the cloister, the sound of axes splitting the chapel doors, the screams of brothers who could not run fast enough. He wrote not as a historian, but as a witness, and his words convey something that the dry annals of Flodord cannot: the sheer paralyzing helplessness of communities that had no military tradition, no walls capable of withstanding assault, and no expectation that the political authorities would arrive in time to help. The Frankish response to this sustained catastrophe was by and large to pay. The practice of Danegeld, the payment of massive quantities of silver to persuade Viking forces to go away, became the default strategy of Frankish kings who lacked the military capacity to defeat the raiders in the field. Between 845 and 926, Frankish sources record at least 13 major payments to Viking armies, totaling thousands of pounds of silver. The payments worked in the short term and failed catastrophically in the long term. Each payment demonstrated that raiding Francia was profitable. Each profitable season attracted more ships the following year. The Danegeld did not buy peace, it bought a mailing list for next season's raiders. This was the world that Rollo entered when he brought his warband south from Scandinavia, probably sometime in the 880s. He was not the first Viking to raid the Seine Valley, nor the most famous at the time. That distinction belonged to other Norse and Danish leaders who had been exploiting Frankish weakness for decades. But Rollo possessed something that distinguished him from the majority of raiders who came, plundered, and returned home. He stayed. The transition from raider to settler was not instantaneous. It was a process that unfolded over approximately 2 decades, and the sources allow us to trace its broad contours even when the specific details remain obscure. Rollo's early years in Francia followed the standard Viking pattern. He raided, he extracted tribute. He used the river network, particularly the Seine, as a highway system that gave him access to the richest agricultural land in northern Europe. His warband grew as success attracted followers, which is the fundamental dynamic of Norse leadership. A chieftain who wins battles and distributes plunder attracts more warriors, which allows him to win larger battles and distribute more plunder, which attracts more warriors still. Failure reversed the cycle with equal speed. But Rollo did not fail. Not in those early years. What set him apart was a quality that Dudo, writing with the benefit of hindsight and considerable bias, characterizes as wisdom, but which might more accurately be described as strategic patience. Other Viking leaders raided and withdrew. They treated Francia as a resource to be extracted, to strip it, load the ships, sail home, spend the winter, and return next season. Rollo began to do something different. He began to hold territory. The distinction matters enormously. A raider needs speed, mobility, and the willingness to disengage when confronted by superior force. A settler needs the opposite. He needs to dig in, to build defenses, to establish relationships with the local population that go beyond terror. He needs, in short, to start behaving less like a pirate and more like a lord. And the evidence suggests that Rollo began making this transition earlier than most of his contemporaries, for reasons that likely had as much to do with his personal circumstances as with any grand strategic vision. He was an exile. He could not go home. The fjords were closed to him, and unlike the seasonal raiders who maintained farms and families in Scandinavia, Rollo had no base to return to. Francia was not his hunting ground. It was his future. And a man who sees a landscape as his future treats it differently than a man who sees it as his present opportunity. He builds where the other man burns. He negotiates where the other man demands. He invests in relationships that the seasonal raider has no use for. This is not to sentimentalize the process. Rollo's transition from raider to settler was drenched in blood. He was not a benevolent occupier gently integrating into the local community. He was a warlord establishing control through the same combination of violence and pragmatism that Norse chieftains had employed for generations. The difference was that his violence had a purpose beyond plunder. It was directed toward permanence. When he burned a town, it was to break resistance to his authority, not to fill his ships. When he spared a town, it was because its submission served his long-term interests. The calculus was different, and the difference mattered. Flodoard's annals give us glimpses of Rollo during this period. Terse, factual entries that record his movements along the Seine, his conflicts with other Viking groups competing for the same territory, and his increasingly complex interactions with Frankish authorities. What emerges from these entries is a picture of a man who was simultaneously fighting on multiple fronts, against the Franks, against rival Vikings, and against the inherent instability of his own position. He had no institutional authority, no legal claim to anything, no legitimacy beyond the loyalty of his warband and the fear of his neighbors. Everything he held by force and reputation alone. And reputation in the 9th century was only as durable as the last victory. The great test came in 885, when a massive Viking force, numbering perhaps 700 ships, though medieval chroniclers were notoriously unreliable with fleet sizes, besieged Paris. The Siege of Paris is one of the defining events of the Viking Age, and its relationship to Rollo is a matter of persistent historical debate. Dudo places Rollo at the center of the siege, casting him as the leader of the entire Viking force. Modern historians are skeptical. The siege was more likely led by a Danish chieftain named Sigfrid, with Rollo possibly present as a subordinate commander, or possibly not present at all. What matters for our story is not whether Rollo personally battered the walls of Paris, but what the siege demonstrated about the state of Frankish defenses and the opportunities it created for a man with Rollo's particular combination of ambition and patience. Paris in 885 was not the sprawling metropolis of later centuries. It was essentially a fortified island, the Ile de la Cité, sitting in the middle of the Seine, connected to both banks by 2 bridges and defended by a garrison of perhaps 200 men under the command of Count Odo and Bishop Jocelyn. The bridges were the key. They blocked the passage of longships upstream, and the Vikings needed to pass them to reach the rich lands of Burgundy and the upper Seine Valley. The siege was, at its core, a transportation dispute prosecuted with catapults and fire ships. The Parisians held, for months, through winter, through disease, through assaults that left the stones of the bridge towers slick with blood. They held. Count Odo fought with a personal ferocity that made him a legend, appearing at every breach, rallying every faltering defense until the exhausted Vikings finally agreed to negotiate. And the negotiation produced the result that defined the era. The Frankish Emperor Charles the Fat paid them to leave. He gave them 700 pounds of silver and permission to sail upstream and raid Burgundy, someone else's problem. It was Danegeld on a monumental scale, and it broke what little remained of imperial prestige. Charles the Fat was deposed within 2 years. Count Odo, the defender of Paris, became king of the Western Franks, and the political map reshuffled once again. For Rollo, watching from whatever vantage point he occupied during these events, the siege of Paris was an education in the limits of the raiding model. 700 ships, thousands of warriors, months of effort, and the result was a one-time payment of silver and the right to go raid somewhere else. The transactional nature of the outcome would have been obvious to a man who thought in terms of permanence rather than profit. Silver spent. Land endured. A payment of Danegeld bought a season. A grant of territory bought a future. The lesson would take another quarter century to bear fruit. But the seed was planted in those smoke-blackened months outside the walls of Paris. And when the moment came, Rollo would be ready to propose an arrangement that no Frankish king had seriously considered and no Viking chieftain had dared to imagine. The years between the Siege of Paris and the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte in 911 were, for Rollo, a long and bloody apprenticeship in the art of territorial control. He fought. He negotiated. He made and broke alliances with other Viking leaders. He terrorized the Seine Valley with sufficient regularity that the Frankish authorities began to regard him not as a random natural disaster, but as a persistent political problem, which, from Rollo's perspective, represented significant progress. A natural disaster is endured. A political problem is negotiated with. His base of operations crystallized around the lower Seine, in the region that would eventually become the heart of Normandy. The area had enormous strategic advantages. The Seine gave access to Paris and the Frankish interior. The coastline gave access to the English Channel and the wider Atlantic. The land itself was among the most fertile in northern Europe. Flat, well-watered alluvial plains that had supported dense agricultural populations since Roman times. The towns along the river, Rouen chief among them, were established centers of trade with existing infrastructure, churches, and administrative traditions that a new ruler could co-opt rather than build from scratch. Rollo was not the only Viking leader operating in this area. The Lower Seine was contested territory, and the competition among Norse and Danish warbands was as fierce as the conflict with the Franks, but Rollo had advantages that his rivals lacked. He had size, both physical, which mattered in personal combat, and in the symbolic politics of leadership and military, as his accumulated reputation continued to draw warriors to his banner. He had persistence. 2 decades of continuous presence in the region, building relationships, learning the terrain, understanding the political dynamics of the Frankish court, and he had, by the early 10th century, something that most Viking leaders in Francia did not have: a family. He had taken a Frankish wife, or more precisely, a Frankish companion, since the sources are unclear about whether any formal marriage ceremony occurred. Her name was Papa, and she was, according to Dudo, the daughter of a Frankish count named Berenger. Whether Papa came to Rollo willingly, as part of a diplomatic arrangement, or as a captive who was elevated to consort status, is impossible to determine from the sources. What matters is that she bore Rollo a son named William, who would become the second Duke of Normandy and whose descendants would reshape the map of Europe. The presence of Papa and young William in Rollo's household signaled something that silver payments and seasonal raids could not: intention. An investment in the next generation, a stake in the continuity of what Rollo was building. This was the man. Exile warrior, father, territorial lord without a territory, chieftain without a crown, who in the year 911 stood at the fulcrum of one of the most consequential negotiations in European history. The crisis that brought both parties to the table was characteristically brutal. In the summer of 911, Rollo led a major assault on the city of Chartres, roughly 80 miles southwest of Paris. Chartres was an important ecclesiastical center, home to a cathedral that housed a relic believed to be the tunic of the Virgin Mary, one of the most sacred objects in Christendom. Rollo likely cared nothing for the tunic's spiritual significance, but cared very much about the ransom it would command and the wealth of the surrounding countryside. The attack on Chartres was a disaster. A combined Frankish force under the Duke of Francia and the Duke of Burgundy met Rollo's army outside the city walls and inflicted a decisive defeat. The sources describe a Frankish cavalry charge that shattered the Norse shield wall, a rout in which hundreds of Rollo's warriors were killed, and a retreat so chaotic that Rollo himself barely escaped with his life. It was the worst military defeat of his career, and it arrived at a moment when he could least afford it. His warband was depleted. His reputation, the currency on which his entire power structure rested, was damaged. Another defeat would mean the dissolution of everything he had spent 20 years building, as his surviving warriors drifted away to follow more successful leaders. But Rollo's defeat at Chartres was also a defeat for the Frankish strategy of military resistance. The campaign had required the combined forces of 2 major duchies, which meant that for the duration of the fighting, those forces were unavailable to defend against any other threat. The Franks had won one battle at enormous cost, and Rollo's forces, though beaten, remained in the Seine Valley. They had not been destroyed. They had not been driven back to Scandinavia. They were still there, still dangerous, still capable of regrouping and returning. The Franks had won the battle and solved nothing. It was Charles the Simple, Charles III of France, called the Simple, not because he was foolish, but because the Latin simplex meant straightforward or honest, who saw the opportunity in the stalemate. Charles was not a powerful king. His authority was contested, his treasury depleted, his military capacity dependent on nobles who served him only when it suited their own interests. He could not defeat Rollo permanently. He could not afford to keep paying Danegeld. He could not ignore the problem, but he could perhaps transform it. The idea was radical. It was not entirely unprecedented. Frankish kings had granted land to Viking leaders before in smaller arrangements that had generally failed, but nothing on this scale had been attempted. Charles proposed to give Rollo formal legal authority over the territory he already effectively controlled. The lower Seine Valley centered on Rouen. in exchange for three conditions. First, Rollo would convert to Christianity and accept baptism. Second, he would swear an oath of fealty to the Frankish crown, acknowledging Charles as his overlord. Third, and most crucially, he would defend his new territory against all other Viking raiders, transforming himself from the problem into the solution. It was, depending on one's perspective, either the most pragmatic diplomatic arrangement of the early medieval period or the most abject surrender a Christian king had ever made to a pagan pirate. It was probably both. The negotiations took place in the autumn of 911 at Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, a small settlement on the river Epte that marked the rough boundary between Frankish-controlled territory and the lands Rollo's forces had been occupying for years. The choice of location was itself significant. A borderland, a place between worlds, where neither party could claim to be receiving the other on home ground. The diplomacy was conducted through intermediaries, as was standard for negotiations between parties of unequal social standing in the early medieval period. Rollo did not sit across a table from Charles the Simple. Messages were carried back and forth by bishops and nobles who served as translators, witnesses, and guarantors of good faith. The terms that emerged from these negotiations have been reconstructed from multiple sources, none of which agree on every detail. What is clear is the broad architecture of the agreement. Rollo received the county of Rouen and the surrounding territory, a substantial but not enormous grant of land comprising roughly the eastern half of what would become Normandy. The western portions, including the Cotentin Peninsula and the regions around Bayeux and Avranches, would be added in subsequent grants over the following decades, as Rollo and his successors demonstrated their capacity to govern and their value as buffers against other Norse raiders. In exchange, Rollo accepted baptism, pledged his fealty to the Frankish crown, and committed to defending the Seine Valley against further Viking incursions. The baptism was the ceremonial centerpiece of the arrangement, and it is here that the sources provide one of the most memorable and possibly apocryphal anecdotes of the entire Viking age. Dudo of Saint-Quentin describes the scene in the church where Rollo received the sacrament, kneeling before the Archbishop of Rouen, renouncing his pagan gods, and accepting the Christian name Robert, a name chosen to honor his Frankish godfather Robert, Duke of Francia. The ceremony was the public performance of a transformation that everyone present understood was primarily political. Rollo was not experiencing a spiritual awakening. He was meeting the minimum requirements of a land deal. The Christian God was the price of admission to the Frankish political system, and Rollo paid it with the same pragmatic calculation he had applied to every other transaction in his life. But it was the oath of fealty that produced the anecdote that has echoed through 1,000 years of historical retelling. In the Frankish feudal system, the act of swearing fealty to a lord involved a specific physical ritual. The vassal knelt, placed his hands between the hands of his lord, and then sealed the oath by kissing the lord's foot. It was a deliberate act of submission, a bodily performance of hierarchy that left no ambiguity about who was superior and who was subordinate. When Rollo was instructed to kiss King Charles's foot, he refused. According to Dudo, Rollo declared that he would never bend his knee before any man, and when his advisors urged him to comply with the custom, he ordered one of his warriors to perform the act in his place. The warrior, rather than kneeling, seized the king's foot, lifted it to his mouth while Charles was still standing, and toppled the king backwards onto the floor. The Frankish courtiers were horrified. Rollo's warriors laughed. Whether this actually happened is impossible to verify. Dudo was writing 80 years after the event, and the story has the suspiciously perfect structure of a scene designed to illustrate Norse defiance in contrast to Frankish formality. It may be a folk memory of a genuine moment of diplomatic awkwardness, or it may be pure invention, then a story the Normans told about their founder to remind themselves that they had entered Frankish civilization on their own terms. What makes the anecdote invaluable, regardless of its factual accuracy, is what it reveals about the tensions embedded in the agreement itself. The Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte was a compromise between two incompatible worldviews, and both sides knew it. The Franks saw the arrangement as the subordination of a barbarian chieftain within their feudal hierarchy, a pagan brought to heel by baptism and vassalage. The Norse saw it as a mutual agreement between equal parties, a transaction in which one side offered land and the other offered security, with neither party genuinely subordinate to the other. This tension between the Frankish understanding of what Rollo had agreed to and the Norse understanding of what Rollo had accepted would define the political dynamics of Normandy for generations to come. The territory Rollo now held was in many respects a ruin. Decades of Viking raiding had devastated the lower Seine Valley. The great monasteries, the institutional anchors of the region's economy, literacy, and administration, were abandoned or destroyed. Saint-Wandrille, which had been one of the richest abbeys in northern Francia, was an empty shell. Jumièges, whose destruction had inspired that anonymous monk's anguished Latin verse, was a pile of scorched stone. The monks had fled south and east, carrying their relics and manuscripts to safer houses in the Frankish interior, and with them had gone the literate class that maintained records, educated children, and administered the legal and economic systems that made organized society function. The towns were depopulated. Rouen, which would become Rollo's capital, had been sacked multiple times, and its population was a fraction of what it had been under Carolingian rule. The countryside was scarred by the peculiar devastation that raiders inflict, not the systematic destruction of a conquering army that intends to occupy, but the random, opportunistic damage of forces that take what they can carry and burn what they cannot. Mills were wrecked, bridges were down, fields that had been cultivated for centuries were reverting to scrub. The irrigation channels and drainage systems that maintained the productivity of the alluvial plains had been neglected for years, and the land, though naturally fertile, was producing a fraction of its potential. The human landscape was equally damaged. The Frankish population that remained, peasants, minor clergy, local officials who had nowhere else to go, regarded their new Norse overlords with a combination of terror, resentment, and wary pragmatism. These were the people who had watched the longships come up the river year after year. They had seen their churches burned, their livestock driven off, their neighbors killed or enslaved, and now the men who had done this to them were being given legal authority over them by their own king. The psychological dimension of this arrangement, asking a traumatized population to accept their tormentors as their lords, is easy to understate from a distance of 11 centuries. It was the central human challenge that Rollo faced, and his response to it would determine whether the fledgling territory survived its first generation. Rollo's warriors presented their own set of problems. They were Norse fighting men, accustomed to a life of movement, raiding, and the seasonal rhythm of violence that had defined their existence for years or decades. They had followed Rollo because he was a successful war leader who could provide plunder and glory. Now he was asking them to settle down, farm land, respect the property of Frankish peasants, and submit to the behavioral constraints of a Christian feudal society. For many of them, this was not what they had signed up for. The promise of land was attractive. Owning your own farm was the deepest aspiration of Norse culture, the prize that the fjords had denied them. But the cultural transformation required to claim that promise was enormous. And this is where Rollo revealed the quality that separates him from every other Viking leader of his generation. He adapted. The adaptation was not gentle, and it was not sentimental. Rollo did not hold community meetings to discuss the feelings of his Frankish subjects or conduct sensitivity seminars for his Norse warriors. He governed the way Norse chieftains governed, through a combination of personal authority, swift justice, and the understood threat of overwhelming violence against anyone who challenged his rule. But within that framework, he made choices that were genuinely revolutionary. He kept Frankish administrative structures intact wherever they still functioned. Rather than imposing Norse systems of governance on a Frankish population, he co-opted the existing ones. The county system, the church parishes, the network of local officials who collected taxes, adjudicated disputes, and maintained what passed for civil order. All of this Rollo preserved. He did not have the manpower or the institutional knowledge to replace it. What he had was the wit to recognize that destroying a functional system and attempting to build a new one from scratch in a territory where he was outnumbered by his own subjects would be suicidal. He also, and this is the detail that Dudo emphasizes most and that modern historians find most plausible, established a legal code that applied equally to Norse and Frankish inhabitants. The details of this code are largely lost, but its reported essence was simple. Property rights would be enforced, theft would be punished severely, and violent crime would meet swift retribution regardless of the perpetrator's ethnic origin. Dudo tells a story, probably embellished but based on a genuine tradition, that Rollo tested his new legal system by leaving gold bracelets hanging from the branches of an oak tree near a public road. No one took them. Whether this was because the population had internalized the new legal norms or because they were terrified of the consequences is, from a governance perspective, an academic distinction. The gold stayed on the tree, order prevailed. The intermarriage policy was perhaps the most consequential of all Rollo's decisions, though it may not have been experienced as a formal policy at the time so much as a practical inevitability that Rollo chose to encourage rather than resist. Norse warriors who received land grants in Normandy needed wives to work those farms, produce heirs, and integrate into the local communities where they now lived. There were not enough Norse women in the settlement to meet this need. Frankish women were available, and many of them had lost fathers, brothers, and husbands to the same raids that had brought the Norse to their doorsteps. The resulting marriages, some voluntary, some coerced, most falling into the broad gray area that characterized all marriage in the medieval period, produced a generation of children who were biologically and culturally hybrid. They spoke both Norse and Frankish. They understood both legal traditions. They attended Christian churches and heard stories of Thor and Odin from their fathers' halls. They were, within a single generation, neither fully Norse nor fully Frankish. They were something new. They were Normans. The speed of this cultural transformation is one of the most remarkable features of the Norman story, and it has fascinated historians for over a century. Within 2 generations, roughly 50 to 60 years, the Norse settlers of the lower Seine Valley had abandoned the Old Norse language in favor of a dialect of Old French. They had adopted Frankish naming conventions, Frankish inheritance customs, Frankish architectural styles, and Frankish legal vocabulary. They had rebuilt the monasteries their fathers had burned and were endowing them with land grants and silver. The grandsons of men who had sacrificed to Odin were founding priories and going on pilgrimage. But the transformation was not total, and the elements that survived from Norse culture were arguably more consequential than the elements that were abandoned. The Normans retained the Norse instinct for long-distance maritime enterprise, the belief that the sea was not a barrier but a highway, and that distant lands represented opportunity rather than danger. They retained the Norse political flexibility, the willingness to adapt to local conditions rather than imposing a rigid template, the pragmatic approach to religion and law that treated both as tools for governance rather than ends in themselves. And they retained, perhaps above all, the Norse capacity for organized violence at scale, the ability to project military force across vast distances with efficiency and discipline that their contemporaries found alternately admirable and terrifying. What they added from Frankish culture was equally transformative. They absorbed the Frankish feudal system, the hierarchical structure of lord and vassal, the precise definition of rights and obligations, the legal framework that turned personal loyalty into institutional governance. They absorbed Frankish Christianity, not just as a spiritual practice, but as an administrative technology, using the church's network of parishes, monasteries, and bishoprics as the infrastructure for education, record-keeping, and political control. They absorbed Frankish military innovations, particularly the heavy cavalry tactics and castle-building techniques that had been developed to counter the very raids that Rollo's generation had conducted. The result was a hybrid culture of extraordinary potency. The Normans combined Norse aggression with Frankish organization, Norse adaptability with Frankish institutional depth, Norse maritime ambition with Frankish continental sophistication. They were, in essence, Vikings with an administrative apparatus. And this combination would prove to be one of the most formidable political and military forces the medieval world had ever produced, but all of that lay in the future. In the years immediately following the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, Rollo faced the more immediate challenge of simply holding what he had been given. The first test came not from the Franks, but from his fellow Vikings. The treaty had given Rollo legal authority over the Lower Seine, but it had done nothing to deter other Norse raiding parties from entering the region. These raiders regarded the Seine Valley as open hunting ground, and they neither knew nor cared about Rollo's arrangement with the Frankish king. When they came, Rollo had to fight them, not as a rival chieftain competing for plunder, but as a territorial lord defending his land. The distinction was critical. A rival chieftain might negotiate a division of spoils or agree to a joint venture. A territorial lord had to repel the invaders completely, or his Frankish subjects would conclude that his protection was worthless, and his Frankish overlord would conclude that the treaty had failed. Rollo repelled them. The details are sparse in the sources, but Flodoard records several engagements in the years following 9/11 in which Rollo's forces intercepted Norse raiders on the Seine and drove them back. These were not glorious, set-piece battles of the kind that Dudo would later embellish for literary effect. They were the grinding, unglamorous work of border defense, patrols, ambushes, coastal watches, the maintenance of a permanent military readiness that consumed resources and demanded constant vigilance. It was exactly the work that Charles the Simple had bargained for when he signed the treaty. And the fact that Rollo performed it faithfully tells us something important about his character. He honored his commitments. Not because he was noble or honest by nature, the sources give us no basis for such a judgment, but because he understood that the arrangement served his interests only as long as both parties kept their word. The second test came from the Franks themselves. Not all Frankish nobles had accepted the treaty. The idea of granting sovereign authority to a Norse pirate offended both their pride and their strategic instincts, and some of them actively worked to undermine Rollo's position. The political landscape of early 10th century Francia was a web of competing interests. Kings, dukes, counts, bishops, each pursuing their own advantage. And Rollo's new duchy was a piece on a chessboard he only partly understood. He knew how to fight. He was learning how to govern. But the intricate, multi-layered game of Frankish court politics, the shifting alliances, the dynastic marriages, the strategic betrayals conducted through layers of intermediaries, was a world away from the straightforward politics of the Norse warband. He made mistakes. In 923, Rollo broke his agreement with the Frankish crown and launched a major raid into Frankish territory beyond the borders of his duchy, burning towns along the Oise and the Beauvaisis in what appears to have been either a renegotiation tactic or a response to perceived Frankish provocations. The details are murky. Flodoard records the devastation without explaining the cause, but the consequences were clear. The raid damaged Rollo's credibility as a reliable treaty partner and strengthened the hand of Frankish nobles who had argued against the original agreement. It was a reversion to type, a moment when the old raider reasserted himself over the new duke, and it took years of subsequent diplomacy to repair the damage. He also made decisions that revealed the limits of his cultural transformation. Dudo records, with visible discomfort, that Rollo in his final years made donations to both Christian churches and pagan temple, hedging his spiritual bets with the same pragmatism he applied to everything else. The story may be apocryphal, another tale shaped by the needs of later Norman identity, but it captures a truth about the first generation of Norse settlers that the official narrative of conversion and integration cannot fully contain. These men had changed their religion as part of a political transaction. Their inner worlds, the beliefs, the fears, the sense of sacred order that shaped how they understood their place in the cosmos, did not transform as easily as their public behavior. Rollo had knelt in a church and received holy water. Whether the old gods released their grip on his imagination is a question no source can answer. Rollo died sometime around 930, possibly as late as 932. The exact date, like so much else about his life, is uncertain. He was approximately 70 years old, an extraordinary lifespan for a man who had spent decades in active combat at sea and in the physically demanding conditions of early medieval life. He had outlived most of his contemporaries, Norse and Frankish alike. He had arrived in Francia as an exile with a warband and a reputation. He was leaving it as the founder of a dynasty, the lord of a territory that bore his people's name, and the architect of a political arrangement that had proved more durable than anyone, perhaps including Rollo himself, had expected. He was buried, according to Dudo, in the cathedral at Rouen. A Viking chieftain, born in the fjords of Norway, baptized into the faith of a civilization he had spent decades trying to destroy, laid to rest beneath the stones of a Frankish church in a city his longships had once sacked. The contradictions of his life did not resolve at his death. They simply passed like an inheritance more complex than land or title to his son. William Longsword, William I of Normandy, though later numbering systems would obscure this, inherited his father's duchy and his father's dilemma. He was the son of a Norse warlord and a Frankish noblewoman, raised in both cultures, fluent in both languages, and trusted completely by neither side. The Frankish aristocracy saw him as a barbarian son who had been given a title he did not deserve. The Norse warriors who had followed his father saw him as dangerously Frankish, too comfortable in Christian churches, too willing to defer to Frankish customs, too far removed from the longship culture that had built the duchy in the first place. William navigated these tensions with considerable skill but imperfect success. He expanded the duchy's territory, securing grants from the Frankish crown that added the Cotentin Peninsula and the region around Avranches to Norman control. He deepened the integration of Norse and Frankish populations, encouraging the intermarriage and cultural blending that his father had begun. He maintained the military strength that was the duchy's ultimate guarantee of survival, keeping a force of Norse warriors capable of defending the territory while simultaneously building relationships with the Frankish church and aristocracy that gave his rule a veneer of conventional legitimacy. But the unresolved tensions of the duchy's hybrid identity caught up with him. In 942, William Longsword was assassinated. He was lured to a meeting on an island in the Somme by Count Arnulf of Flanders, who had him murdered. The precise method varies by source, but the treachery is consistent in all accounts. The assassination was a political act driven by Arnulf's desire to eliminate a rival and by the broader Frankish discomfort with a Norse-ruled territory that was growing too powerful and too independent. William's death left the duchy in the hands of his son Richard, who was approximately 10 years old, a child duke in a territory surrounded by hostile or opportunistic neighbors, with a warrior aristocracy that was still partly pagan and a Frankish population that was still partly resentful. By every conventional measure, the Duchy of Normandy should have collapsed. The political entity that Rollo had created through violence, pragmatism, and a single desperate treaty was exactly 1 generation old, and its survival now depended on a boy who could not yet hold a sword. What happened instead is one of the most improbable stories of political survival in the medieval period, and it tells us more about the durability of what Rollo had built than any account of his own lifetime could convey, because the duchy did not collapse. The institutions held. The alliances, Norse and Frankish, military and ecclesiastical, internal and external, proved resilient enough to sustain a minor duke through the most vulnerable years of his childhood. The Norse warriors did not abandon the young Richard for a stronger leader. The Frankish population did not revolt. The church, which had been rebuilt and re-endowed by Rollo and William, provided the administrative continuity and the educated advisors that kept the government functioning. Richard survived. He grew to adulthood. He became Richard I of Normandy, Richard the Fearless, and he ruled the duchy for over 50 years, consolidating everything his father and grandfather had built and transforming Normandy from a tenuous Viking settlement into one of the most powerful and sophisticated principalities in Western Europe. It was Richard who commissioned Dudo of Saint-Quentin to write the official history of the Norman dukes, recognizing that a dynasty needed not just land and soldiers, but a story, a narrative of origin and destiny that could bind his people together and present their improbable history as part of a divine plan. And it was during Richard's long reign that the cultural transformation Rollo had initiated reached its fullest expression. The Norse language disappeared from daily use, replaced entirely by the Norman French dialect that would, a century later, cross the English Channel and reshape the English language itself. The monasteries that Rollo's generation had burned were now among the most prosperous and intellectually vibrant in Northern Europe. Their scriptoria producing manuscripts, their schools educating the sons of the Norman aristocracy, their lands generating the wealth that funded the duchy's military ambitions. The Norman Church became a vehicle of reform and intellectual achievement that radiated influence far beyond the duchy's borders. The military culture, meanwhile, had completed its own transformation. The Norse raiding tradition had fused with Frankish heavy cavalry tactics and the revolutionary innovation of castle building to produce a military system of terrifying effectiveness. Norman knights, mounted, armored, trained from childhood in the specific skills of cavalry warfare, were, by the mid-11th century, the most sought-after soldiers in Europe. Norman castles, first the simple motte and bailey structures of earth and timber, later the massive stone keeps that still dot the landscapes of England, Sicily, and the Holy Land, gave their builders the ability to project permanent military authority over conquered territory in a way that no previous medieval military system had achieved. This was Rollo's legacy, though he could never have imagined its form. The exile from the fjords, the raider who knelt reluctantly in a Frankish church, the aging warrior who traded his longship for a duchy, he had set in motion a chain of consequences that would ripple outward across centuries and continents. The hybrid culture he had accidentally created by settling his Norse warriors on Frankish soil, by marrying Norse swords to Frankish institutions, by forcing two incompatible civilizations to coexist within a single political entity. This culture was about to break out of its small corner of northern France and remake the Western world. Within 150 years of Rollo's death, his descendants would be ruling England, Sicily, and Antioch simultaneously. Norman adventurers carrying the culture their great-grandfather had forged in the Seine Valley would establish themselves as the military aristocracy of half of Europe. The Norman conquest of England in 1066, and the event that more than any other defines the boundary between the Anglo-Saxon and the medieval English world, was a direct consequence of the treaty that a desperate Frankish king had signed with a Norse pirate on the banks of the Epte. But that story, the story of what Rollo's descendants did with the inheritance he left them, requires its own telling. And it begins with the most famous Norman of them all, a man who was born a bastard, raised under constant threat of assassination, and would die as the conqueror of the richest kingdom in northern Europe. The line from Rollo to William the Conqueror runs straight and unbroken, 5 generations of escalating ambition, each building on what the last had created, each reaching further than the last had dared. Rollo's grandson, Richard the Fearless, had consolidated the duchy into something permanent. His son, Richard II, Richard the Good, would refine it into something elegant. Richard the Good ruled from 996 to 1026, 30 years of relative stability during which Normandy's transformation from Viking settlement to European principality became irreversible. He deepened the duchy's ties to the Frankish church, patronized monasteries with a generosity that would have bewildered his great-grandfather, and cultivated diplomatic relationships with powers across Western Europe. He married Judith of Brittany, cementing an alliance with the duchy's western neighbor. He maintained the military readiness that was Normandy's insurance policy while simultaneously building the administrative sophistication that made the duchy governable in peacetime. But it was one particular diplomatic relationship that Richard the Good cultivated, a relationship that seemed at the time like a minor footnote to the larger politics of Northern Europe, that would produce the most consequential outcome in the entire Norman story. Across the English Channel, the Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of England was experiencing its own Viking crisis. The raids that had devastated Francia and Rollo's time had struck England with equal ferocity, and by the late 10th century, a renewed wave of Scandinavian aggression was threatening to overwhelm the English defenses entirely. The English king, Ethelred II, known to history as Ethelred the Unready, a nickname derived from the Old English unread, meaning poorly counseled, a pun on his name that delighted his detractors, was struggling to hold his kingdom together against Danish armies that were better led, better organized, and better motivated than anything England had faced in a century. In 1002, desperate for allies and political support, Ethelred married Emma, the daughter of Richard the Good of Normandy. The marriage was a diplomatic arrangement of the most conventional kind, a strategic alliance between a beleaguered English king and a powerful continental duke, sealed in the traditional currency of a noblewoman's body and the children it might produce. Emma crossed the Channel and became Queen of England, bringing with her a retinue of Norman advisors, Norman churchmen, and Norman cultural expectations that planted the first seeds of Norman influence in English soil. The marriage did not save Ethelred. In 1013, a massive Danish invasion under King Svein Forkbeard drove the English royal family into exile, and they fled naturally to Normandy, to Emma's family, to the duchy that Rollo had carved out of the wreckage of northern Francia a century earlier. The English king and queen sheltered at the Norman court, refugees dependent on their in-laws' hospitality, while Svein and then his son Knut the Great established Danish rule over England. Emma, with the political instincts of her Norman breeding, adapted. After Ethelred's death, she married Knut himself, becoming Queen of England for a second time under a different dynasty and a different husband. It was a breathtaking act of pragmatic reinvention that would have made Rollo proud. But the children of her first marriage, the sons she had borne to Ethelred, remained in Normandy, raised at the Norman court, educated in Norman customs, surrounded by Norman nobles and Norman ambitions. The eldest of these sons was Edward, who would eventually be known as Edward the Confessor, and who would return to England in 1042 to claim the throne after the collapse of the Danish dynasty. Edward came home a stranger. He had spent most of his life in Normandy, and the England he returned to was a country he barely knew, ruled by an aristocracy he did not trust. Operating under customs he found alien. He surrounded himself with Norman advisors. He appointed Normans to English bishoprics. He built Westminster Abbey in the Norman Romanesque style. And he maintained close, arguably dependent relationships with his Norman cousins, particularly with a young man named William, the current Duke of Normandy, who was, by blood and political calculation, the person most likely to benefit from Edward's reign. This was the chain: Rollo to Richard the Fearless, to Richard the Good, to Emma, to Edward, to William. Each link forged by the particular combination of violence, diplomacy, marriage, and opportunism that characterized Norman political culture. Each link carrying the consequences of Rollo's original decision to stay, to settle, to build something permanent on the banks of the Seine, one step further from its origin and one step closer to the event that would transform England and through England, the world. But the link in that chain that mattered most, the man who would take everything his ancestors had built and stake it on a single audacious gamble, was not born to inherit anything at all. William was a bastard. The word carried a specific and devastating legal meaning in 11th century Normandy. William was the son of Robert I, Duke of Normandy, Rollo's great-great-grandson, and a woman named Herleva, who was, depending on which source you consult, either the daughter of a tanner or the daughter of an embalmer, occupations that placed her firmly outside the aristocratic class from which ducal consorts were traditionally drawn. Robert and Herleva were never married. Their relationship appears to have been genuine. Robert kept Herleva close, acknowledged William publicly, and treated him as his heir. But the absence of a formal marriage meant that William's claim to the duchy rested entirely on his father's personal authority and the willingness of the Norman aristocracy to accept an illegitimate successor. That willingness would prove to be extremely limited. Robert I died in 1035, on the return journey from a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. He had taken the extraordinary precaution of having his vassals swear loyalty to the young William before his departure, but oaths sworn to a living duke about his 7-year-old bastard son had a tendency to evaporate the moment the duke stopped breathing. Robert died somewhere in Anatolia, far from Normandy, far from the son he had tried to protect, and the duchy descended into a chaos that would have destroyed a lesser inheritance. William was 7 years old. He was illegitimate. He was a child in a political culture that respected only demonstrated strength, and the Norman aristocracy, scenting opportunity in the vacuum left by Robert's death, began to tear the duchy apart. What followed was a decade of murder, rebellion, and betrayal that reads like a catalog of medieval political violence at its most intimate and most brutal. William's guardians were killed one after another with a regularity that suggests organized elimination rather than random misfortune. His steward was stabbed. His tutor was murdered. A man named Osborne, who served as his seneschal and sleeping in the same chamber as the young duke to protect him, was killed in William's presence, throat cut in the middle of the night by assassins who had entered the room while both man and boy slept. The sources record that William was hidden by loyalists in the homes of peasants, moved from location to location under cover of darkness, kept alive by the devotion of a small circle of retainers who had either genuine loyalty to Robert's memory or sufficient strategic foresight to wager on the boy's eventual survival. The duchy fractured into competing factions. The Western Viscounts, who had never fully accepted ducal authority, saw their chance for independence. Minor nobles, who had nursed grievances under Robert, settled their scores with violence. The border regions were raided by opportunistic neighbors. For nearly a decade, Normandy was consumed by the kind of anarchic civil conflict that Rollo's original settlement had been designed to prevent. The very chaos that made Viking Age Francia so vulnerable now replaying itself within the borders of the Viking-founded duchy. William survived. The specifics of how he survived his childhood are poorly documented. The period between 1035 and approximately 1047 is one of the most obscure in Norman history, precisely because the administrative apparatus that normally generated records had largely broken down. But survive he did, and when he emerged from the shadows of his minority, the young duke who confronted the Norman aristocracy was something that none of them had anticipated. He was relentless. The first clear picture we get of William as an active political agent comes from 1047, when he was approximately 19 years old. A major rebellion had coalesced in western Normandy, led by a coalition of viscounts and minor nobles who challenged William's authority and, implicitly, his right to rule. The rebellion was serious enough that William could not suppress it with his own resources. He did something that revealed both his desperation and his political intelligence. He appealed to his feudal overlord, King Henry I of France, for military assistance. Henry responded. A combined Franco-Norman army met the rebels at the Battle of Valesdune near Caen in 1047. The battle was a decisive victory for William. Though the details preserved in the sources are frustratingly thin, we know that the rebel coalition was shattered, that many of the leading conspirators were killed or captured, and that William's authority over the duchy was, for the first time since his father's death, backed by demonstrated military force rather than inherited legal claim. Valesdune was the beginning, not the end. The next 2 decades of William's rule in Normandy were a continuous process of consolidation, suppressing rebellions, neutralizing rivals, building castles at strategic points throughout the duchy, and forging the Norman military machine into the most disciplined and effective fighting force in northern Europe. He was ruthless in a way that even his contemporaries found notable. When the town of Alençon mocked his illegitimate birth during a siege, the defenders hung animal hides from the walls and shouted taunts about tanners, a reference to his mother's alleged parentage. William took the town and had the hands and feet of the defenders amputated. The mutilations were not acts of rage. They were communications, carefully calibrated messages to every other fortified town in the duchy about the cost of defiance. Alençon never rebelled again. Neither did most of the towns that heard about what happened there. By the early 1060s, William had transformed Normandy from a fractured, rebellion-prone duchy into the most centralized and militarily potent principality in France. His control was personal, direct, and total, in a way that no Norman duke before him had achieved. He had built or rebuilt castles across the duchy, each garrisoned by men who owed their positions directly to him. He had reformed the Norman church, appointing bishops and abbots who were simultaneously men of genuine spiritual conviction and competent administrators loyal to the ducal government. He had cultivated a class of Norman knights, the minor aristocracy who formed the heavy cavalry that was the duchy's primary military instrument, through a system of land grants and feudal obligations that bound their fortunes inextricably to his own. And he had, through all of this, maintained his relationship with Edward the Confessor across the Channel. The nature of that relationship is one of the most contested questions in medieval history, because everything that followed depends on what Edward promised William and when he promised it. The Norman sources, Dudo's successors, the chroniclers William of Jumièges and William of Poitiers, both writing to justify what the Normans were about to do and claimed that Edward promised the English crown to William. They placed this promise variously in the 1050s, during a period when Edward was politically weak and dependent on Norman support. They describe it as a formal, witnessed commitment, a dying king's designation of his chosen successor. The English sources tell a different story, or rather, they tell no story at all about such a promise, which is itself telling. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the primary English source for this period, makes no mention of any promise to William. English historians writing after the conquest tend to describe Edward's intentions as ambiguous, or to claim that Edward designated the English nobleman Harold Godwinson as his successor on his deathbed in January 1066. What is beyond dispute is that Edward the Confessor died on the 5th of January 1066 without a direct heir. The English Witenagemot, the assembly of nobles and churchmen who traditionally confirmed the succession, chose Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in England, as the new king. Harold was crowned the very next day in a ceremony whose haste suggests that everyone involved understood the succession would be contested. When news of Harold's coronation reached Normandy, William's response was immediate and absolute. He declared that the English crown was rightfully his. He claimed that Edward had promised it to him. He further claimed that Harold himself had sworn an oath to support William's succession during a visit to Normandy in 1064, an oath that Harold had allegedly sworn over a chest of holy relics, making it not merely a political commitment but a sacred vow before God. Harold's coronation, in William's framing, was not just a political affront. It was perjury, sacrilege, and theft. Whether William genuinely believed all of this, or whether he was constructing a legal and moral framework for an invasion he intended to undertake regardless, is unknowable at this distance. What matters is that the framework was effective. William secured the blessing of Pope Alexander II, who sent a papal banner to accompany the invasion, transforming what was, in practical terms, a cross-channel military adventure by a French duke into a holy cause endorsed by the head of Christendom. He secured the support of his own Norman vassals, which was not automatic. Many of them were deeply reluctant to risk everything on a seaborne invasion of a wealthy, well-defended kingdom. And he recruited thousands of additional soldiers from Brittany, Flanders, Maine, and across northern France, men drawn by the promise of English land, English wealth, and the opportunity to participate in what William was billing as the righteous restoration of a stolen inheritance. The preparations consumed the better part of a year. William assembled a fleet of perhaps 700 ships, some purpose-built, some requisitioned, some contributed by vassals fulfilling their feudal obligations. He gathered an army of somewhere between 7,000 and 12,000 men, though the exact number is impossible to determine. He stockpiled supplies, weapons, armor, and the thousands of horses that his cavalry would need on the far shore. The logistics alone represented one of the most ambitious military operations attempted in Western Europe since the Roman period. And then the wind refused to cooperate. For weeks in late summer of 1066, William's army sat on the Norman coast at Dives-sur-Mer, waiting for a southerly wind that would carry them across the Channel. The army consumed its supplies. Men grew restless. The seasonal window for a major amphibious operation was closing. Every day that passed increased the likelihood that the invasion would have to be abandoned, that the army would disperse, and that William's claim to England would dissolve into the kind of failed ambition that medieval chroniclers quietly forgot. William waited. He moved the fleet eastward along the coast to Saint-Valery-sur-Somme, shortening the crossing distance and positioning for the wind shift that his sailors told him would eventually come. He kept his army together through a combination of personal authority, continued promises of English wealth, and the understood reality that any man who left now would forfeit his share of whatever was won. The discipline required to hold an army of that size in camp for weeks, consuming resources that could not be replaced while waiting for a weather event that might never arrive. This was leadership of an order that purely military skill could not provide. It required the political instincts, the psychological acuity, and the sheer immovable stubbornness that William had been developing since he was a hunted child hiding in peasant cottages. On the 27th of September, the wind turned south. The fleet sailed that night. 700 ships carrying the army that would end Anglo-Saxon England crossed the Channel in darkness, guided by a lantern on the masthead of William's flagship, the Mora, which had been given to him by his wife Matilda. They landed at Pevensey Bay on the morning of the 28th of September, 1066, and found the beach undefended. Harold Godwinson was not there. Harold was 300 miles to the north near York, dealing with a completely separate invasion. Harold Hardrada, the King of Norway, one of the most formidable warriors of the age, a man who had fought in the Byzantine Emperor's personal guard, campaigned across the Mediterranean, and claimed the English throne through his own convoluted line of Norse succession, had landed in northern England with a massive Norwegian army and was ravaging Yorkshire. Harold Godwinson had force-marched his army north at extraordinary speed, met the Norwegians at Stamford Bridge on the 25th of September, and destroyed them in one of the most decisive battles of the medieval period. Harold Hardrada was killed. The Norwegian army was shattered so completely that of the 300 ships that had carried them to England, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. It was one of Harold's finest military achievements, and it may have cost him everything. 3 days after Stamford Bridge, exhausted, depleted, and 300 miles from the southern coast, Harold received word that William had landed at Pevensey. He turned his army south and marched. The speed of Harold's response has been debated by military historians for centuries. He covered roughly 250 miles in approximately 13 days, an impressive but not superhuman pace for an army that combined mounted household troops with infantry. What is more significant than the speed is the decision itself. Harold chose to confront William immediately rather than waiting to gather reinforcements, rest his exhausted troops, and prepare a defensive position closer to London. The reasons for this choice are speculative. Perhaps Harold feared that delay would allow William to consolidate his beachhead and ravage the countryside, undermining the political legitimacy that Harold's kingship depended upon. Perhaps he was confident after his victory at Stamford Bridge, riding the momentum of a spectacular triumph. Perhaps he simply miscalculated. Whatever the reason, on the morning of the 14th of October, 1066, Harold's army took up a defensive position on a ridge approximately 6 miles northwest of Hastings, blocking the road to London. William's army, which had been plundering the surrounding countryside for 2 weeks, possibly as a deliberate provocation to force Harold into a premature engagement, advanced to meet them. The Battle of Hastings lasted approximately 9 hours from morning until dusk, and it was the single most consequential military engagement in the history of the British Isles. Harold's position was strong. His army occupied the crest of a ridge, their flanks protected by marshy ground, and their front presented to the enemy as a solid wall of shields. The English fought on foot in the traditional Anglo-Saxon manner, the housecarls, Harold's professional warriors, forming the core of the line with their great two-handed axes, the furred militia filling the ranks on either side. It was a defensive formation, designed to absorb and repel attacks, and it was, by the standards of 11th century warfare, extremely difficult to break. William's army attacked uphill. The Norman tactics relied on a coordinated combination of archers, infantry, and heavy cavalry, a combined arms approach that was sophisticated by contemporary standards but that faced enormous challenges against a disciplined enemy holding high ground. The archers fired uphill, which reduced their range and effectiveness. The infantry advanced into a wall of shields and axes. The cavalry charged uphill on horses that were already tired from the approach, against men who were not afraid of horses and who carried weapons specifically designed to kill them. The first attacks failed. The Norman left wing, composed largely of Breton troops, broke and fled downhill in disorder. A portion of the English line, possibly militia troops who mistook the retreat for a general rout, broke formation and pursued them down the slope. William's cavalry turned on the pursuers and slaughtered them. It was the first crack in Harold's defensive wall, and William may have noted its cause: the English tendency to abandon their strong position when they believed the enemy was fleeing. What happened next is described by the Norman sources as a deliberate tactical innovation, and by modern military historians with varying degrees of skepticism. William ordered his cavalry to conduct feigned retreats, charges that appeared to break and flee, designed to lure portions of the English line off the ridge and into the open ground below, where they could be cut down by waiting horsemen. Whether these retreats were genuinely planned or simply the chaos of battle reinterpreted by chroniclers seeking to credit William with tactical genius is debatable. What is clear is that over the course of the afternoon, the English line was gradually weakened by casualties, by exhaustion, by the incremental loss of men who pursued retreating cavalry and never made it back to the ridge. The final phase of the battle came in the late afternoon. William ordered his archers to fire at a high angle, sending arrows over the shield wall to fall among the densely packed defenders on the reverse slope. The combined effect of hours of attrition, the repeated cavalry charges, and the arrow storm finally broke the English formation. Harold's brothers, Gurth and Leofwine, had already been killed earlier in the fighting, and then Harold himself fell. The manner of Harold's death has been debated for nearly 1,000 years, largely because of a single image in the Bayeux Tapestry, the great embroidered narrative of the conquest commissioned by William's half-brother Odo, which appears to show a figure pulling an arrow from his eye above the Latin inscription Harold Rex interfectus est, King Harold is killed. The arrow in the eye tradition became the dominant account, but the tapestry is ambiguous. The figure with the arrow may not be Harold. The figure being struck down by a mounted knight in the adjacent panel may be Harold instead, or the tapestry may be showing both moments: Harold wounded by the arrow and then cut down by cavalry, the two events compressed into adjacent panels in the manner of medieval visual narrative. However he died, Harold Godwinson was dead by nightfall on the 14th of October. His army disintegrated. The surviving housecarls fought to the last around the fallen king's standard, the Dragon of Wessex and the Fighting Man, in a final stand that the Norman sources record with something approaching admiration. By dark, the ridge was a field of corpses, and William, Duke of Normandy, great-great-great-grandson of a Norse pirate, who had knelt in a Frankish church 155 years earlier, stood as the effective conqueror of the richest kingdom in northern Europe. He was not yet king. The coronation would come on Christmas Day 1066 in Westminster Abbey, the church that Edward the Confessor had built in the Norman style, as if unconsciously preparing the stage for what was to come. The ceremony was conducted by the Archbishop of York, and it was marred by a characteristic moment of violence. The Norman soldiers standing guard outside the abbey, hearing the shouts of acclamation from within and mistaking them for an English uprising, set fire to the surrounding buildings. The congregation fled in panic. The archbishop's hands trembled as he completed the rites. William himself, according to one account, was visibly shaking, not with fear, but with the compressed tension of a man who understood that the moment he had spent his entire adult life pursuing was finally, irrevocably upon him. The crown was placed on his head. The Norman duke became the English king, and the consequences of that transformation would reshape not just England, but the English language, English law, English architecture, English social structure, and the English relationship with continental Europe for the next millennium. But the crown was only the beginning. Conquering England at Hastings was a single day's work. Holding England would take the rest of William's life. The England that William had seized was not a blank page waiting for a Norman author. It was one of the most sophisticated kingdoms in Western Europe, wealthier than Normandy, more administratively complex, more deeply rooted in its own traditions of governance, law, and culture than any territory the Normans had previously encountered. The Anglo-Saxon state that Harold Godwinson had ruled, and that his predecessors had built over the course of 2 centuries, possessed institutions that had no parallel on the continent. It had a national tax system. It had a network of shires and hundreds, administrative subdivisions with defined boundaries, established courts, and appointed officials that allowed the crown to project authority into every corner of the realm. It had a coinage system controlled by the central government with dies distributed from London to regional mints and periodically recalled to prevent counterfeiting. It had a legal tradition embodied in written law codes stretching back to the 7th century that defined rights and obligations with a specificity that Frankish custom could not match. William, with the instincts of a man descended from 5 generations of pragmatic adapters, did not destroy any of this. He co-opted it. This was the Norman genius at work, the same genius that Rollo had demonstrated when he preserved Frankish administrative structures in the Seine Valley a century and a half earlier. William did not impose Norman governance on England. He inserted Norman personnel into English institutions and let those institutions continue functioning. The shire courts kept meeting. The 100 courts kept adjudicating. The tax system kept collecting. What changed was not the machinery, but the operators. English earls were replaced by Norman barons. English bishops were replaced by Norman prelates. English abbots were replaced by Norman churchmen. The language of administration shifted gradually but inexorably from Old English to Norman French and Latin. But the structures themselves, the deeply embedded administrative architecture that made England governable, survived the conquest largely intact. The speed with which William redistributed English land is staggering, even by the standards of medieval confiscation. Within 20 years of Hastings, virtually every major landholding in England had been transferred from English to Norman hands. The mechanism was deceptively simple and brutally effective. William declared that all land in England belonged to the crown, a principle that had theoretical precedent in Anglo-Saxon law, but that no previous English king had enforced with such comprehensiveness. He then granted this land to his followers as fiefs, held in exchange for specified military service. Every Norman baron who received an English estate owed the king a precise number of armed knights to be provided on demand, equipped and mounted, ready for campaign. The entire kingdom became a military franchise, with land as the currency and armed service as the rent. The English aristocracy, the earls, the thegns, the minor landholders who had formed the governing class of Anglo-Saxon England, were systematically dispossessed. Some were killed at Hastings or in the rebellions that followed. Some fled into exile, many of them to Scandinavia, others to the Byzantine Empire, where a contingent of displaced Anglo-Saxon warriors joined the Varangian Guard and fought for the emperor in campaigns across the eastern Mediterranean. The irony was exact. English warriors, dispossessed by the descendants of Vikings, found employment as the personal bodyguard of a Byzantine emperor, serving alongside actual Scandinavians in a unit that had been founded to employ Norse mercenaries. The Viking world, in its final phase, was folding in on itself. Those English landholders who were not killed or exiled were simply demoted. They found themselves tenants on land their families had owned for generations, paying rent to Norman lords who spoke a language they could not understand, answering to a legal system that was being modified in ways they had no power to influence. The social dislocation was total. An entire ruling class was replaced, not over decades or generations, but within years, with a ruthlessness that reveals the true nature of the Norman conquest. It was not a change of dynasty, it was the replacement of one civilization's elite with another's. And yet, and this is the paradox that makes the Norman conquest so historically significant, the English system was not destroyed, it was captured. The Normans took over an administrative apparatus that was in many respects superior to their own, and they used it to govern more effectively than they had ever governed Normandy. The English tax system allowed William to extract revenue with an efficiency that continental kings could only dream of. The English legal system, adapted and augmented by Norman innovations, produced a body of common law that would eventually become the foundation of legal systems across the English-speaking world. The English tradition of centralized royal authority, strengthened rather than weakened by the conquest, created a monarchy more powerful and more administratively capable than any in Western Europe. The most extraordinary expression of this captured administrative power came in 1085, when William ordered the compilation of the Domesday Book, a comprehensive survey of virtually every landholding, every tenant, every plow team, every mill, every fish pond, every cow, sheep, and pig in the kingdom. Nothing like it had been attempted since the Roman census. Nothing comparable would be attempted again for centuries. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded the reaction of the English population with a mixture of awe and resentment that still resonates across 900 years of distance. The Chronicle noted that William sent his men all over England into every shire and had them find out how many hundred hides there were in the shire, what land the king himself had, what stock there was upon the land, or what dues he ought to have in 12 months from the shire. He also had a record made of how much land his archbishops had, his bishops, his abbots, and his earls, and what or how much everybody had who was occupying land in England in land or cattle, and how much money it was worth. So very narrowly did he have it investigated that there was no single hide nor yard of land, nor indeed, the Chronicle's author wrote with bitter precision, one ox, nor one cow, nor one pig that was left out and not put down in his record. The English called it the Domesday Book because its authority was as final as the Last Judgment. There was no appeal from its findings. What it recorded was, for legal purposes, reality itself. And what it recorded was a kingdom of astonishing wealth and productivity, governed with an administrative precision that had no parallel in the medieval West. This was what Rollo's legacy had produced. Not just a dynasty of conquerors, but a dynasty of administrators, men who understood with an instinct bred into them across 5 generations that conquest without governance was merely raiding on a larger scale, and that the true measure of power was not the ability to destroy a system, but the ability to seize one and make it serve new masters. But if the Normans' administrative genius was Rollo's most enduring gift to his descendants, their military ambition was his most visible. And the reach of that ambition extended far beyond the English Channel. While William was conquering England, other Normans, men with no ducal title and no great inheritance, younger sons and landless knights carrying nothing but their skill at arms and the culture of opportunistic expansion that Normandy bred like a contagion, were building kingdoms of their own at the opposite end of Europe. The Norman conquest of southern Italy and Sicily is, in some respects, even more improbable than the conquest of England, because it was accomplished not by a duke with an army, but by a handful of adventurers with almost nothing. The story begins in the early 11th century when Norman pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land passed through southern Italy and discovered a region ripe for exploitation. The Italian south was a patchwork of competing powers, Lombard principalities, Byzantine provinces, Muslim emirates in Sicily, and papal territories whose borders were contested and whose defenses were inadequate. It was, in short, the kind of fragmented, wealthy, militarily weak landscape that Normans had been exploiting since Rollo first sailed up the Seine. The first Norman adventurers in Italy hired themselves out as mercenaries, fighting for whoever would pay them. Lombards against Byzantines, Byzantines against Muslims, one Lombard prince against another. They were superb soldiers, and their services were in constant demand. But they quickly recognized that fighting for others was less profitable than fighting for themselves, and within a generation the mercenary bands had transformed into conquest machines. The family that came to dominate the Norman enterprise in Italy was the Hautevilles, the sons of a minor Norman knight named Tancred de Hauteville, who held a small estate in the Cotentin Peninsula and who produced by 2 successive wives a total of 12 sons. 12 sons and 1 modest estate meant that most of those sons had no future in Normandy, and one by one they migrated south to Italy, where their military skills and their Norman willingness to seize opportunity made them the dominant force in the region within a single generation. The greatest of the Hauteville brothers were Robert Guiscard and his younger sibling Roger. Robert Guiscard, the name means the cunning or the resourceful, a nickname he earned and deserved, arrived in Italy around 1047 with virtually nothing and proceeded to conquer the entire southern third of the Italian peninsula through a 30-year campaign of military brilliance, diplomatic manipulation, and calculated brutality that rivaled anything William was accomplishing across the Channel. By 1059, Pope Nicholas II had formally recognized Robert as Duke of Apulia, Calabria, and Sicily, titles that Robert had essentially claimed by force and that the papacy endorsed because the alternative was to have a hostile Norman warlord on its southern border. Roger, the youngest Hauteville brother, took on the conquest of Sicily, a Muslim-held island that had been under Islamic rule for over 2 centuries. The Sicilian campaign lasted 30 years, from 1061 to 1091, and it was a masterpiece of the gradual, methodical territorial expansion that characterized Norman military operations at their best. Roger did not attempt to conquer the entire island at once. He established beachheads, built castles, consolidated control over one district before moving to the next, and systematically dismantled Muslim resistance through a combination of military pressure and strategic tolerance. When he finally completed the conquest, he governed his Muslim subjects with a pragmatism that would have been instantly recognizable to Rollo. He did not force conversion, he did not destroy mosques, he employed Muslim administrators, retained Islamic legal traditions for the Muslim population, and created a multicultural court that blended Norman, Byzantine, and Islamic elements into something unlike anything else in the medieval world. Roger's son, Roger II, would take this foundation and build it into the Kingdom of Sicily, one of the wealthiest, most culturally sophisticated, and most efficiently governed states in 12th century Europe. The court at Palermo was a place where Norman knights ate alongside Arab scholars, where Greek was spoken in the same halls as Arabic and Norman French, where the king wore a mantle embroidered with Arabic calligraphy and counted Muslim astronomers and Jewish physicians among his closest advisors. The Norman kingdom of Sicily was, in its way, the most perfect expression of the hybrid culture that Rollo had initiated. The demonstration that Norse adaptability, fused with whatever local civilization it encountered, could produce political entities of extraordinary sophistication and power, and the Norman reach extended further still. When Pope Urban II called the First Crusade in 1095, summoning the warriors of Christendom to march east and recapture Jerusalem from Muslim control, the Normans were at the vanguard. Bohemond of Taranto, Robert Guiscard's son, Tancred de Hauteville's grandson, a man who stood 6.5 feet tall and possessed a strategic intelligence that his contemporaries found genuinely frightening, led one of the principal armies of the crusade. His nephew Tancred, named for the patriarch of the Hauteville dynasty, fought beside him. Together they played decisive roles in the siege of Antioch, the march to Jerusalem, and the establishment of the Crusader states that would endure in the Levant for nearly 2 centuries. Bohemond claimed Antioch for himself, establishing the Principality of Antioch as a Norman state in the heart of the Muslim world. It was the furthest reach of the Norman expansion, a direct territorial line from Rollo's settlement on the Seine to a principality on the banks of the Orontes River in what is now Turkey, a distance of over 2,000 miles spanning 6 generations, connecting a Norse exile's desperate land deal with a Crusader prince's kingdom in the Levant. The ambition was breathtaking. The audacity was pure Norman. And the through line, the cultural DNA that linked Rollo's adaptation in Normandy to Bohemond's adaptation in Antioch, was the same quality that had defined the Norman character from its inception. The capacity to arrive in an alien civilization, absorb its strengths, impose their own military will upon it, and produce something that was neither the original culture nor the imported one, but an alloy stronger than either. By the early 12th century, barely 200 years after Rollo's baptism in that small church near the Epte, his descendants and their cultural inheritors controlled England, southern Italy, Sicily, and Antioch. Norman knights served in the armies of the Byzantine Empire, the kingdoms of Spain, and the courts of Scotland. Norman churchmen held bishoprics from York to Palermo. Norman architects were building cathedrals and castles whose ruins still dominate landscapes from Northumberland to Calabria. The Norman diaspora, this extraordinary explosion of military energy, administrative talent, and cultural adaptability radiating outward from a single river valley in northern France, was the most dramatic example of sustained territorial expansion in Europe between the fall of Rome and the age of Atlantic exploration. And all of it traced back to one man's decision to stay. Rollo could have raided the Seine Valley and returned to Scandinavia. He could have extracted his silver and moved on. He could have done what every other Viking leader of his generation did, treat Francia as a resource, not a home. Instead, he stayed. He settled. He married into the local population. He preserved the institutions he found rather than destroying them. He accepted baptism, swore fealty, defended his territory against other raiders, and built something permanent in a landscape of impermanence. And in doing so, he created a culture that inherited the best qualities of two civilizations and wielded them with a ruthlessness and adaptability that neither civilization alone could have produced. The question that historians have debated for centuries, and the question that makes Rollo's story more than a colorful medieval adventure, is whether any of this was intentional. Did Rollo foresee what he was creating? Did he understand that the hybrid culture emerging in the Seine Valley would produce conquerors and kingdom builders who would reshape the map of Europe? Or was he simply a pragmatic old warrior making the best deal available to him, securing his retirement, protecting his family, and leaving the consequences to be sorted out by men not yet born? The honest answer is that we cannot know. The sources do not give us access to Rollo's inner life. Dudo of Saint-Quentin, writing to glorify the Norman dukes, presents Rollo as a figure of providential destiny, a man chosen by God to found a dynasty and bring Christianity to the pagan north. This is propaganda, not psychology. Flodoard of Reims, the most reliable of our chroniclers, records Rollo's actions without interpreting his motivations. The sagas preserve his physical description and his reputation, but not his thoughts. We are left to infer intention from behavior, and behavior across 11 centuries is a treacherous guide. What we can say with confidence is that Rollo's decisions, with whatever their motivation, created the conditions for everything that followed. The decision to stay in Francia rather than returning to Scandinavia. The decision to hold territory rather than merely raiding it. The decision to preserve Frankish institutions rather than destroying them. The decision to encourage intermarriage rather than enforcing separation. The decision to accept baptism and enter the Frankish political system rather than remaining outside it. Each of these decisions was individually pragmatic, a rational response to immediate circumstances by a man whose survival depended on reading situations accurately and acting accordingly. But their cumulative effect was transformative. They created Normandy, and Normandy created the medieval world. The irony, and there is always irony in the Norman story because irony was embedded in its DNA from the moment a Viking pirate knelt in a Christian church, is that the culture Rollo created eventually consumed its own origins. Within 3 generations, the Normans had forgotten their Norse language. Within 4, they had forgotten their Norse gods. Within 5, they were building the monasteries and cathedrals that their ancestors had burned, endowing the very institutions that their great-grandfathers had looted. and fighting crusades in the name of the faith that their founding patriarch had adopted as a political convenience. The Norse identity that had defined Rollo's warband was absorbed so completely into the Frankish cultural landscape that by the time of the conquest of England, the Normans thought of themselves not as reformed Vikings, but as the flower of French Christian civilization. And yet the Norse qualities persisted beneath the surface. The maritime confidence, the comfort with long-distance military enterprise, the pragmatic adaptability, the willingness to absorb the strengths of conquered peoples rather than imposing rigid cultural uniformity. These were the qualities that allowed William to capture the English administrative system rather than destroying it. These were the qualities that allowed Roger to govern Muslim Sicily with tolerance rather than persecution. These were the qualities that allowed Bohemond to establish a viable crusader state in one of the most culturally complex regions on earth. The Normans had forgotten they were Vikings, but the Viking within them, that restless, adaptive, opportunistic intelligence, had not forgotten how to operate. The legacy extends further than kingdoms and conquests. It extends into the foundations of the modern world in ways that are so deeply embedded they have become invisible. The English common law tradition, the legal system that governs not just England, but the United States, Canada, Australia, India, and dozens of other nations that inherited English legal principles, is a direct product of the Norman conquest. William's fusion of English legal traditions with Norman feudal concepts created a hybrid legal system that developed over centuries into the common law as we know it. The very concept of trial by jury, though it has Anglo-Saxon antecedents, was formalized and institutionalized by Norman and Plantagenet kings building on the administrative foundations that William established. The principle that the law applies equally to all subjects, a principle that Rollo, according to Dudo, enforced in his own crude fashion with gold bracelets hanging from oak trees, evolved through centuries of English legal development into the constitutional principles that underpin democratic governance across the English-speaking world. The English language itself bears the Norman imprint so deeply that it is impossible to speak modern English without using Norman French vocabulary. The linguistic consequences of the conquest were not immediate. For generations after 1066, England was a trilingual society, with Norman French spoken by the aristocracy, Latin used by the church and the legal profession, and English spoken by the common people. But as the Norman and English populations gradually merged, through intermarriage, through the slow erosion of ethnic boundaries, through the same process of cultural blending that had created the Normans in the first place, and the languages merged as well. English absorbed thousands of Norman French words, predominantly in the domains of law, governance, military affairs, cuisine, and social status. The result was a language of extraordinary richness and flexibility, capable of expressing the same concept in both Anglo-Saxon and Norman French registers. A linguistic duality that gives modern English its remarkable range of tone and nuance. Consider the simplest illustration. The Anglo-Saxon farmer raised cows, sheep, and pigs. The Norman lord ate beef, mutton, and pork. The English words for the living animals survived in the mouths of the people who tended them. The French words for the cooked meat survived in the mouths of the people who consumed them. This single linguistic division, preserved in every English-speaking kitchen for 1,000 years, is a fossilized record of the social hierarchy that the Norman conquest created, a hierarchy in which those who labored spoke one language and those who feasted spoke another. The architectural legacy is equally pervasive. The great cathedrals and castles that the Normans built across England, Durham, Norwich, the Tower of London, the White Tower that still anchors the fortress complex beside the Thames, established a monumental architectural tradition that defined English building for centuries. The Norman Romanesque style, with its massive pillars, rounded arches, and overwhelming sense of weight and permanence, was a deliberate statement of power. These buildings were designed to impress, to intimidate, and to communicate in stone what the conquest had communicated in blood, that the new order was here to stay, that its authority was backed by resources that could reshape the physical landscape itself, and that resistance was not merely feudal, but irrelevant in the face of such transformative force. The castles were instruments of control as much as architecture. William and his followers built castles at an extraordinary pace, dozens within the first decade of the conquest, hundreds by the end of the century. Each castle was a node in a network of military authority that allowed a relatively small Norman garrison to control a much larger English population. The motte and bailey design that the Normans favored, an earthen mound topped by a wooden or stone tower surrounded by an enclosed courtyard, could be erected in weeks and garrisoned by a handful of knights. It was the technology that made the conquest permanent, the physical infrastructure of occupation that transformed a battlefield victory into a governing reality. This is the full measure of what began on that gray autumn morning in 911, when an aging Norse warrior knelt in a Frankish church and accepted a duchy he had spent 30 years earning through terror. Rollo could not have known. He could not have imagined the cathedrals, the law codes, the language, the castles, the kingdoms scattered from the Atlantic to the Levant. He was doing what he had always done, or surviving, adapting, making the best deal available, and trusting that the future would take care of itself. The future did more than take care of itself. It exceeded every possibility that the 9th century could have conceived. And the man who set it all in motion, the exile from the fjords, the raider who became a duke, the pagan who accepted a baptism he may never have believed in, lies beneath the stones of Rouen Cathedral, in the city he once sacked and later made his capital, in the heart of the land that still bears his people's name. Normandy itself, in the decades after Rollo's death, became something that no one, least of all the Frankish kings who had authorized its creation, had anticipated. It became a laboratory, a place where the collision of two civilizations produced innovations in governance, warfare, religion, and culture that would radiate outward across medieval Europe with a force that the small territory's size could never have predicted. To understand why the Normans achieved what they achieved, why this particular hybrid culture, forged in this particular river valley at this particular moment in history, produced results so disproportionate to its origins, we must look more closely at what Normandy actually became in the century between Rollo's death and William's invasion of England. Because the conquest of 1066 was not an improvisation, it was the culmination of a century of institutional development so purposeful, so methodical, and so brilliantly adapted to the realities of medieval power that it deserves to be understood on its own terms, not merely as a prologue to Hastings. The ecclesiastical transformation was perhaps the most dramatic. The monasteries that Rollo's generation had destroyed were not merely rebuilt, they were reimagined. The Norman dukes, beginning with William Longsword and accelerating under Richard the Fearless and Richard the Good, poured resources into monastic foundations with a generosity that served simultaneously as penance, policy, and investment. The rebuilt abbeys of Jumièges, Saint-Wandrille, Fécamp, and Mont-Saint-Michel became not just houses of prayer but centers of learning, administration, and economic power that anchored the duchy's governance in a way that secular institutions alone could not have achieved. The monks who staffed these houses were not the terrified refugees who had fled the Viking raids carrying armloads of manuscripts. They were educated, ambitious, administratively competent men recruited from across northern France and increasingly from the reform movements that were reshaping European monasticism in the 10th and 11th centuries. The Norman dukes cultivated relationships with the great reform centers, Cluny in Burgundy, Gors in Lotharingia, and imported their methods, their discipline, and their personnel. The result was a Norman church that combined reformist spiritual rigor with a practical orientation toward governance that made the monasteries, in effect, the civil service of the duchy. The abbots managed estates. They maintained records. They educated the sons of the aristocracy. They provided the literate administrators who staffed the ducal court and conducted the diplomatic correspondence that connected Normandy to the wider European world. They were, in functional terms, the institutional memory of a society that was still, in its secular dimension, largely illiterate. Without them, the duchy could not have been governed. With them, it was governed with an efficiency that its neighbors found remarkable and increasingly threatening. The monastic scriptoria, the writing rooms where monks copied manuscripts, composed chronicles, and maintained the administrative records of the duchy, were engines of cultural production that transformed Normandy's intellectual landscape within 2 generations. The catalogue of the library at Fécamp, compiled in the mid-11th century, lists works of theology, philosophy, classical literature, canon law, and practical administration that rivaled the collections of much older and more established centers of learning. The monks of Jumièges produced illuminated manuscripts of extraordinary beauty. The scholars of Bec, a monastery founded in the 1030s by an Italian knight-turned-monk named Herluin, attracted some of the finest minds in Europe, most notably Lanfranc of Pavia, who would become William's Archbishop of Canterbury, and Anselm of Aosta, who would succeed Lanfranc and produce philosophical works that still occupy theologians 9 centuries later. The speed of this intellectual transformation bears emphasis. In Rollo's time, Normandy had been an intellectual wasteland, its monasteries burned, its libraries scattered, its educated class fled to safer regions. A century later, Norman monasteries were producing scholars, administrators, and churchmen who were reshaping religious life across Western Europe. The turnaround was not miraculous. It was purchased deliberately and at considerable expense by a ducal dynasty that understood with crystalline clarity that governance required literacy, that literacy required institutions, and that institutions required investment. The Normans did not stumble into cultural sophistication. They built it, stone by stone and manuscript by manuscript, with the same methodical determination they applied to castle construction and military campaigns. The military transformation was equally purposeful and equally consequential. The Norse warband that Rollo had brought to the Seine Valley, loosely organized, personally loyal to a chieftain rather than to an institution, effective at raiding but poorly suited to sustain territorial defense, had been completely replaced by the mid-11th century by a military system of revolutionary effectiveness. The Norman military machine that William would lead across the Channel was not a Norse warband in Frankish clothing. It was something genuinely new, a synthesis of Norse, Frankish, and locally developed elements that produced capabilities no single tradition could have generated. The foundation was the feudal military obligation. Every Norman baron held his land in exchange for a specified number of armed knights, heavy cavalrymen, mounted on war horses, equipped with lance, sword, shield, and chainmail, trained from adolescence in the specific skills of mounted combat. The feudal levy gave the Duke a military force of predictable size and composition, available on demand, without the need to maintain a standing army or to rely on the unpredictable loyalties of mercenary bands. It was, in essence, a distributed military system, each barony functioning as a small garrison, each baron responsible for maintaining and equipping his quota of knights. The duchy as a whole capable of mobilizing a formidable army on relatively short notice. The knights themselves were the product of a training culture that was, by 11th century standards, remarkably systematic. Norman boys of the aristocratic class began their military education in childhood, learning to ride before they could read, if they ever learned to read at all, and progressing through a curriculum of weapons training, horsemanship, and small unit tactics that culminated in their late teens in the ceremony of knighting that marked their formal entry into the warrior class. The emphasis on cavalry was not merely a tactical preference, it was a social identity. To be a Norman knight was to belong to a privileged caste defined by its relationship to the war horse, the lance, and the feudal obligation. Everything else, land, title, marriage, political influence, flowed from that identity and the military service it entailed. But the Norman military advantage was not simply a matter of better cavalry. It was a matter of combined arms, the coordinated use of cavalry, infantry, and archers in a tactical system that was more flexible and more adaptable than the methods employed by most of their contemporaries. The Battle of Hastings demonstrated this coordination at its most effective, but it had been developed and refined over decades of warfare within Normandy and along its borders. Norman commanders learned to integrate the shock value of the cavalry charge with the sustained pressure of infantry assault and the attritional effect of archery, adjusting the balance depending on terrain, enemy disposition, and tactical opportunity. This flexibility, the willingness to adapt tactics to circumstances rather than rigidly adhering to a single approach, was, once again, the Norse inheritance expressing itself through Frankish military forms. And then there were the castles. The Norman castle was not a defensive structure. It was an offensive weapon. This distinction is crucial to understanding the Norman approach to warfare and conquest, and it separates the Norman castle-building tradition from the fortification practices of most other medieval cultures. A city wall defends a population. A hilltop fort protects a garrison. A Norman castle projects power into a landscape. It is built not where the defender needs protection, but where the attacker needs control. At crossroads, river crossings, harbor entrances, the centers of towns, it is designed to dominate its surroundings, to serve as a base for patrols and punitive expeditions, and to remind every person within sight of its towers that authority resides within those walls and that the cost of challenging it will be calculated in blood. The motte and bailey design that the Normans perfected was brilliant in its simplicity. An artificial earthen mound of the motte was raised to a height of 15 to 30 feet, crowned with a wooden tower that served as the lord's residence and final defensive position. Surrounding the motte at ground level was a larger enclosed area, the bailey, containing stables, storehouses, barracks, workshops, and whatever other structures the garrison required. The whole complex was encircled by a ditch and a palisade of sharpened stakes. The design could be adapted to virtually any terrain, constructed in a matter of weeks using local labor and materials, and defended by a garrison as small as a dozen men against forces many times their number. The wooden towers would, over time, be replaced by stone keeps, the massive rectangular towers that remain the most iconic surviving examples of Norman military architecture. The Tower of London, begun by William in 1078, was the prototype of the stone keep in England, a structure of such imposing bulk that it served as a royal fortress, a prison, and a symbol of Norman authority for nearly 1,000 years. But even before the stone keeps were built, the wooden motte and bailey castles had already accomplished their primary purpose. They had converted a single battlefield victory into permanent territorial control. Each castle was a statement of fact. The Normans are here and they are not leaving. The connection between the Norman military system, feudal cavalry, combined arms tactics, and castle-based territorial control, and the culture Rollo had founded is not metaphorical. It is structural. Every element of the system can be traced to the specific conditions of the Seine Valley settlement. The feudal cavalry evolved from the merging of Norse warrior traditions with Frankish mounted combat. The combined arms approach reflected the Norse willingness to use whatever worked, adapted to Frankish military conventions. The castle-building program was the architectural expression of Rollo's original insight, that the difference between raiding and ruling was permanence, and that permanence required physical infrastructure. The Normans built castles the way their ancestors had built longships, as precision instruments designed to project power across distance and to convert geographic space into political control. This was the machine that crossed the Channel in September 1066, not a raiding party, not a war band. A fully integrated military and administrative system, backed by ecclesiastical institutions of remarkable sophistication, governed by a duke whose personal authority had been forged in a crucible of rebellion and civil war, and animated by a cultural conviction, inherited from 5 generations of pragmatic adapters, that any territory could be seized, any population governed, and any civilization absorbed if one approached the task with sufficient intelligence, sufficient flexibility, and sufficient violence. The question that the conquest raises, and that the subsequent centuries of Norman influence compel us to address, is whether the Norman achievement should be admired, condemned, or simply understood. The answer, inevitably, is all three. Is the administrative and legal innovations that the Normans brought to England, the systematic land survey, the feudal obligation, the integration of secular and ecclesiastical governance, created the foundations of a state that would, over centuries, develop the most stable and influential system of governance in the Western world. The common law, parliamentary government, constitutional monarchy, and the institutional architecture that England would eventually export across the globe grew in soil that the Normans had prepared. This is a matter of historical record, and to deny it would be to deny the evidence of 900 years of institutional development. But the cost was enormous. The Norman conquest was, for the English population that experienced it, a catastrophe. The dispossession of the English aristocracy was total. The economic disruption was severe. The cultural suppression, the marginalization of the English language, the destruction of English literary traditions, the systematic replacement of English churchmen and administrators with Norman imports was comprehensive. The harrying of the North, William's punitive campaign against the rebellious northern counties in the winter of 1069 to 1070, was an act of deliberate devastation so thorough that the Domesday Book, compiled 16 years later, recorded vast swathes of Yorkshire as waste, uninhabited, uncultivated land that had once supported thriving communities. Orderic Vitalis, a Norman-born monk of English and Norman parentage writing in the early 12th century, described the harrying with a horror that transcended his own Norman loyalties. He recorded that William's soldiers burned homes and crops, slaughtered livestock, and destroyed the tools and seed grain that the population needed to survive the winter. The resulting famine killed, by some estimates, tens of thousands of people. Orderic wrote that the bodies of the dead lay unburied in the roads, and that survivors fled south in desperate columns, begging for food from communities that had barely enough for themselves. This was the other face of Norman efficiency. The same administrative precision that produced the Domesday Book, the same military discipline that won Hastings, the same institutional intelligence that preserved the English governance system. All of these qualities, when directed toward destruction, produced devastation of a thoroughness that less competent conquerors could not have achieved. The harrying of the North was not a spontaneous atrocity committed by undisciplined troops. It was a calculated military operation designed to destroy the economic capacity of a rebellious region so completely that it could never again support resistance. It was, in the language of a later century, a counterinsurgency campaign, and its methods would be recognizable to any student of asymmetric warfare. Burn the food supply, destroy the infrastructure, make the civilian population pay the cost of the insurgents' defiance, and the population will ensure that no further defiance occurs. It worked. The north of England did not rebel again. The silence that followed was the silence of a graveyard. To hold Rollo responsible for the harrying of the North would be absurd. The man had been dead for 140 years. But to separate his legacy from its consequences would be equally dishonest. The culture he created was defined by the twin qualities of adaptability and ruthlessness, and those qualities produced both the administrative genius that built functioning states and the military brutality that cleared the ground for them. The Norman story is not a story of heroes or villains. It is a story of a culture that was extraordinarily effective at acquiring and exercising power, and that exercised that power with a consistency that makes moral simplification impossible. The cultural consequences of the conquest extended far beyond the immediate violence and into the centuries that followed, reshaping not just England, but the identity of the English-speaking world in ways that remain visible and audible to this day. The linguistic transformation was the most pervasive and the most enduring. For roughly 3 centuries after the conquest, England was a society divided by language. The Norman aristocracy spoke Norman French, the dialect of Old French that had evolved in the Seine Valley from the contact between Norse settlers and Frankish speakers. The English clergy and legal profession conducted their official business in Latin, which had been the language of the church and of formal documentation since the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons. And the common people, the peasants, the craftsmen, the vast majority of the population continued to speak English, the Germanic language that had been developing in the British Isles since the 5th century. This trilingual arrangement was not stable, and it was not intended to be permanent. It was a consequence of conquest, and like all such consequences, it evolved under the pressure of daily life. The Norman lords needed to communicate with the English tenants who worked their estates. The English tenants needed to navigate the legal and administrative systems that the Normans controlled. The clergy needed to preach to congregations that spoke English while reporting to bishops who spoke French. Over generations, the boundaries between the languages blurred. French words entered English speech. English grammatical structures simplified under the influence of contact with French. And the English language, which in its Anglo-Saxon form had been a heavily inflected Germanic tongue with a rich literary tradition, the language of Beowulf, of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, of the sermons of Elfric, transformed into something radically different. It shed most of its grammatical inflections. It absorbed thousands of French and Latin words. It developed the extraordinary dual vocabulary, the parallel registers of Germanic and Romance terms for the same concepts, that gives modern English its distinctive character. The statistics are striking. Estimates vary, but linguists generally agree that approximately 30% of modern English vocabulary derives from French, with a significant proportion of that French vocabulary entering the language as a direct consequence of the Norman conquest. The domains of influence are revealing. English retained its Germanic vocabulary for the basic activities of daily life: eating, sleeping, working, living, dying. French provided the vocabulary for the activities of power: government, justice, authority, sovereignty, parliament, court, judge, jury, crime, punishment, prison, sentence. The language of warfare shifted from English to French: army, battle, soldier, captain, lieutenant, sergeant, cavalry. The language of cuisine divided along class lines, producing the famous distinction between the English animals and the French meats. The language of culture and refinement became predominantly French: art, beauty, fashion, courtesy, honor, glory, romance. The result was not merely a language with a larger vocabulary, it was a language with a fundamentally different relationship to meaning. Modern English can express virtually any concept in two ways: a Germanic way and a Romance way, with subtly different connotations attached to each: begin and commence, ask and inquire, end and conclude, help and assist, buy and purchase, deep and profound. The Germanic term tends to feel more direct, more physical, more emotionally immediate. The Romance term tends to feel more formal, more abstract, more intellectually precise. This duality is not an accident of linguistic evolution. It is the direct, measurable, ongoing consequence of a Norman duke's decision to invade England in 1066, which was itself the consequence of a Norse exile's decision to settle in the Seine Valley 150 years earlier. The legal legacy was equally transformative. Though its mechanisms were more institutional and less immediately visible than the linguistic changes, William did not replace English law with Norman law. He did something more complex and, in the long run, more consequential. He added Norman legal concepts to the existing English legal framework, creating a hybrid system that developed over centuries into the English common law. The specific Norman innovations were numerous and technical, but several deserve mention for their lasting significance. The feudal land law that William imposed, the principle that all land was held from the crown in exchange for service, with precisely defined rights and obligations attaching to each tenancy, created a framework for property law that persisted in England for centuries and that influenced property law in every jurisdiction that inherited the English legal tradition. The concept of the grand jury, a body of local men impaneled to present criminal accusations to the royal courts, was formalized under William's successors and became a foundational element of the common law system. The centralized royal courts that the Normans established, sending royal justices on regular circuits through the shires to hear cases and enforce the king's peace, created a national legal system that gradually displaced the local and regional courts of the Anglo-Saxon period. The most profound innovation, however, was not any specific legal rule or institution, but rather the Norman approach to law itself. The Normans treated law as an instrument of governance, a tool for maintaining order, extracting revenue, and projecting royal authority into every corner of the realm. This was not how the Anglo-Saxons had understood law. Anglo-Saxon legal culture was rooted in custom, in the accumulated traditions of specific communities, in the expectation that disputes would be resolved through local negotiation rather than centralized adjudication. The Norman approach, centralized, systematic, backed by the coercive power of the state, was fundamentally different, and its triumph over the older English tradition was one of the defining consequences of the conquest. The tension between these two legal philosophies, law as custom versus law as instrument of governance, would play out over the following centuries in ways that shaped the development of English constitutional thought. The Magna Carta of 1215, the most famous legal document in English history, was in one sense a reassertion of customary rights against the centralizing tendencies of Norman royal government. The barons who confronted King John at Runnymede were, many of them, descendants of the Norman knights who had accompanied William across the Channel. They were demanding limits on the very royal authority that their ancestors had helped to create. The irony that the instrument most often cited as the foundation of English liberty was produced by the descendants of a conquering elite seeking to constrain the power they had built is entirely characteristic of the Norman story. It is a story in which every achievement contains the seeds of its own qualification, and every act of power generates the conditions for its own limitation. This dialectic between Norman centralization and English customary resistance, between royal authority and baronial privilege, between the power of the state and the rights of the governed, would prove to be the defining dynamic of English political development for the next 800 years. It produced Parliament. It produced the common law. It produced the principle of habeas corpus and the prohibition against taxation without representation. It produced eventually the constitutional settlements that English colonists would carry across the Atlantic and embed in the founding documents of the United States. The line from Rollo to the Declaration of Independence is not straight, and drawing it requires caveats and qualifications that would fill volumes of their own. But the line exists. The institutional traditions that the American founders drew upon, the common law, parliamentary government, the concept of rights enforceable against the crown, were English traditions developed in the specific historical conditions created by the Norman conquest, shaped by the ongoing negotiation between Norman centralizing power and English customary liberty, and transmitted across an ocean by colonists who understood themselves to be heirs of a legal and political tradition that stretched back through centuries of English constitutional development. That tradition began in its recognizable form when a Norse exile and a Frankish king stood on the banks of the Epte and agreed to a deal that neither fully understood. The consequences of that deal are still being lived, but we are not yet finished with the Normans themselves. Their direct influence on European history did not end with the conquest of England or the establishment of kingdoms in Sicily and the Levant. The Norman diaspora continued to shape events across the medieval world for generations after the initial wave of conquest, producing effects that were sometimes dramatic, sometimes subtle, and almost always more far-reaching than anyone involved could have anticipated. In Scotland, Norman influence arrived not through invasion, but through invitation. The Scottish kings of the 11th and 12th century, particularly David I, who had been raised at the English court, and who admired Norman institutions with the enthusiasm of a reformer, deliberately imported Norman knights, Norman churchmen, and Norman administrative practices into their kingdom. David granted Scottish estates to Norman families, founded monasteries staffed by Norman monks, and reorganized Scottish governance along Norman feudal lines. The great Scottish noble families of the medieval period, the Bruces, the Balliols, the Stuarts, were of Norman origin, their ancestors having crossed from England into Scotland at David's invitation and established themselves as the governing class of a kingdom they had never conquered. The consequences were profound. Scotland, which before David's reign had been a Celtic kingdom with its own distinctive traditions of governance, law, and social organization, was reshaped along Norman lines. The feudal system, the parish church, the burghle town, the chartered market, the institutional framework of medieval Scottish life was, to a remarkable extent, a Norman import. The Scottish Wars of Independence in the 13th and 14th centuries were fought on both sides by men of Norman descent. Robert the Bruce, whose family came from Normandy via England, against Edward I of England, whose own Norman ancestry needed no elaboration. The irony of two Norman-descended aristocracies fighting over the independence of a Celtic kingdom was not lost on contemporary observers, though they expressed it differently than a modern historian might. In Wales, Norman influence was imposed through a long, grinding process of military conquest and colonial settlement that lasted from the late 11th century to the late 13th. The Norman lords of the Welsh Marches, the border region between England and Wales, built castles, established towns, and gradually extended their control over Welsh territory through a combination of military force and political manipulation that replicated, in miniature, the patterns of the English conquest. The great castles of Wales, Chepstow, Pembroke, Caernarfon, Conwy, are Norman and Plantagenet constructions, physical monuments to a process of conquest that reshaped Welsh society as thoroughly as the conquest had reshaped English society a century or two earlier. In Ireland, the Norman impact was equally dramatic and equally complex. The Norman invasion of Ireland began in 1169, when a group of Norman Welsh lords, men whose families had been established in the Welsh Marches for generations, crossed the Irish Sea at the invitation of Diarmait mac Murchada, a deposed Irish king seeking military assistance in his domestic political struggles. The Normans came, as they always did, in small numbers and with large ambitions. Within a few years, they had established control over significant portions of eastern and southern Ireland, built castles, founded towns, and begun the process of displacing the native Irish aristocracy that would continue in various forms for centuries. The Norman colony in Ireland, in the Lordship of Ireland, later the Kingdom of Ireland, never achieved the comprehensive control that the Normans established in England. The Irish political landscape was too fragmented, the terrain too difficult, and the Norman settler population too small to replicate the total conquest that William had accomplished across the Channel. Instead, the Norman presence in Ireland produced a divided society, a Norman-controlled eastern seaboard, the Pale, surrounded by Gaelic Irish territories that the colonial administration could influence but not govern. The cultural consequences were complex and contradictory. The Normans in Ireland gradually adopted Irish language, customs, and social practices, becoming, in the famous phrase, more Irish than the Irish themselves. The Statutes of Kilkenny, enacted in 1366, desperately attempted to prevent the assimilation of the Norman settlers into Irish culture by prohibiting intermarriage, the use of the Irish language, and the adoption of Irish dress. Legislation that testified by its very existence to the completeness of the cultural absorption it was trying to prevent. Here again was the Norman pattern asserting itself, the pattern that Rollo had established in the Seine Valley and that his descendants had replicated wherever they went. Arrive as conquerors, absorb the local culture, produce something hybrid. The Normans in Ireland did exactly what the Normans in Normandy had done and what the Normans in Sicily had done. They merged with the civilization they had conquered, creating a new cultural reality that was neither purely Norman nor purely indigenous, but something unprecedented. The difference was that in Normandy and Sicily, the merger produced stable, powerful states. In Ireland, it produced a centuries-long conflict between the colonists and the colonized that would not be resolved, to the extent that it has been resolved at all, until the 20th century. The Norman footprint in the Crusader states was equally distinctive and equally revealing of the culture's fundamental character. The Principality of Antioch, established by Bohemond of Taranto in 1098, was the most purely Norman of the Crusader states, and its governance reflected the full range of Norman administrative instincts. Bohemond governed Antioch not as a religious zealot administering a holy conquest, but as a Norman lord administering a territorial acquisition that happened to be located in the Levant, rather than in the Seine Valley or the English Midlands. He retained the existing administrative structures wherever possible. He employed local Christians, Greek Orthodox, Armenian, Syriac, in positions of authority. He maintained commercial relationships with Muslim traders. He adapted the feudal system to local conditions, granting fiefs to his followers in exchange for military service while accommodating the property rights and social customs of the indigenous population in ways that more ideologically rigid crusader leaders would not have contemplated. The Principality of Antioch survived for nearly 2 centuries, outlasting Bohemond himself by generations. Its longevity owed much to the same pragmatic adaptability that had characterized Norman governance from the beginning. The Norman lords of Antioch intermarried with the local Armenian and Byzantine aristocracy. They adopted Eastern dress, Eastern cuisine, Eastern diplomatic conventions. They learned Arabic and Greek. They built castles that blended Norman military architecture with Byzantine engineering techniques and Islamic decorative traditions. The great crusader castles of the Levant, Crac de Chevalier, Margat, Sion, owe as much to Norman building traditions as they do to any other single architectural influence, and their ruins still testify to the scale of ambition and the quality of engineering that the Normans brought to the Eastern Mediterranean. But the Principality of Antioch also demonstrated the limits of the Norman model. The Normans could conquer and they could administer, but they could not, in the Levant, achieve the demographic transformation that had made their conquests in Normandy, England, and Sicily permanent. They remained a thin ruling elite perched atop a vastly larger indigenous population, dependent on a continuous supply of reinforcements from Western Europe that became increasingly difficult to maintain as the 12th century progressed and the initial enthusiasm for the Crusades faded. When that supply dwindled, when the Muslim powers of the region, first the Zengids, then Saladin's Ayyubid dynasty, organized effective resistance, the Norman-founded Crusader states found themselves in a position not unlike the one Rollo had faced in the Seine Valley. Outnumbered, far from home, and dependent on the goodwill of neighbors who had every reason to wish them gone. The difference was that Rollo had been able to transform himself and his followers into something the local population could accept, or at least tolerate. The Crusader Normans, bound by the religious identity that had justified their conquest in the first place, could not make the same transformation. They could adapt their governance, their architecture, their daily habits, but they could not cross the fundamental boundary that separated Christian conqueror from Muslim subject. And that boundary, which Rollo's more fluid cultural environment had not imposed, ultimately doomed the Crusader experiment to impermanence. Antioch fell to the Mamluks in 1268. The last Crusader stronghold, Acre, fell in 1291. The Norman presence in the Levant, which had lasted nearly 2 centuries, was erased in a generation. But the architectural, legal, and cultural traces survived. In the castle designs that influenced Islamic military architecture, in the trading networks that connected the Eastern Mediterranean to Western Europe, and in the family histories of noble houses across France, England, and Italy that trace their lineage through Crusader ancestors to the Norman adventurers who had first planted their banners on the walls of Antioch. The Norman kingdom of Sicily followed its own trajectory, distinct from the Crusader states and in many ways more remarkable. Under Roger II, who was crowned King of Sicily in 1130, the Norman South reached an apogee of cultural and political sophistication that was unique in the medieval West. Roger's kingdom encompassed the island of Sicily, the southern Italian mainland from Naples to the tip of Calabria, and the North African coast from Tripoli to Tunis. It was a maritime empire held together by naval power and commercial networks, governed by an administration that drew on Norman, Byzantine, and Islamic traditions with an eclecticism that reflected the diversity of its population. The court at Palermo was the most cosmopolitan in Europe. Roger employed a Greek-speaking bureaucracy inherited from the Byzantine administration that had governed southern Italy before the Norman conquest. He maintained an Arabic-speaking chancery that produced official documents in the language of his Muslim subjects. His personal guard included Muslim soldiers. His closest advisors included men of every faith and nationality. The Cappella Palatina, the chapel of the royal palace in Palermo, which survives to this day, is the physical embodiment of this cultural synthesis. Its walls are covered with Byzantine gold mosaics depicting Christ and the saints. Its ceiling is carved in the Makarna style of Islamic architecture, decorated with Arabic inscriptions and painted figures that would have been at home in any Fatimid palace. Its floor is inlaid with Roman-style marble in geometric patterns. The chapel is simultaneously a Christian church, an Islamic art gallery, and a Byzantine throne room. And it is, perhaps more than any other surviving structure, the material expression of what Norman culture was at its most creative and most self-confident. A civilization that did not merely tolerate diversity but actively synthesized it into something new. Roger II's grandson, Frederick II, in order, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Sicily, King of Jerusalem, and one of the most extraordinary rulers of the medieval period, would inherit this tradition and push it to its most extreme expression. Frederick, who was raised in Palermo and who identified more with his Sicilian Norman heritage than with his German paternal ancestry, maintained a court that scandalized Orthodox Christendom. He kept a harem. He employed Muslim bodyguards. He conducted diplomatic correspondence with Muslim rulers in Arabic. He founded the University of Naples, the first state-sponsored university in Europe. He wrote a treatise on falconry that remains a standard reference 8 centuries later. He recovered Jerusalem for Christendom not through warfare but through negotiation, a diplomatic achievement that earned him excommunication from a pope who would have preferred a bloodier and more doctrinally satisfying victory. Frederick was in many ways the ultimate expression of the Norman cultural project, the demonstration of what happened when Norse adaptability, refined through 6 generations of contact with diverse civilizations, produced a ruler who was genuinely at home in multiple worlds simultaneously. He was also the last great representative of that project. The Hohenstaufen dynasty ended with Frederick's descendants. The Norman kingdom of Sicily passed through Angevin and Aragonese hands, and the unique multicultural experiment that had flourished in the Mediterranean South since the days of Roger I's conquest gradually gave way to the more homogeneous political cultures of the late medieval period, but the influence survived. The administrative systems that the Normans had built in Sicily, the efficient tax collection, the centralized bureaucracy, the integration of diverse legal traditions within a single governing framework, persisted under successive rulers and influenced the development of state administration across the Mediterranean. The architectural innovations of the Norman Sicilian period, the blending of Byzantine, Islamic, and Western European building traditions, produced structures that influenced European architecture for centuries. And the intellectual culture of the Norman Sicilian court, with its emphasis on translation, scholarship, and the cross-pollination of Greek, Arabic, and Latin learning, contributed to the broader intellectual ferment that would eventually produce the Renaissance. The Norman contribution to the transmission of classical knowledge deserves particular emphasis because it is one of the least visible but most consequential aspects of the Norman legacy. The great project of medieval intellectual history, the recovery and translation of Greek philosophical and scientific works that had been preserved in Arabic translation during the centuries when Western Europe had lost direct access to the Greek originals, was facilitated in significant part by the multicultural environments that Norman conquest had created. In Sicily, where Greek, Arabic, and Latin were all in active use, scholars could work directly from Arabic manuscripts into Latin, making available to Western European readers works of Aristotle, Ptolemy, Euclid, and Galen that had been inaccessible for centuries. The translation centers of Norman and post-Norman Sicily, alongside the more famous centers in Toledo, were crucial nodes in the network through which classical knowledge re-entered the Western European intellectual mainstream. This was not a Norman achievement in the narrow sense. The translators were not themselves Norman, and the intellectual ambition that drove the translation movement had roots in the broader European hunger for classical learning that transcended any single political entity. But the Norman created political conditions, and the multicultural courts, the patronage of scholarship, the institutional infrastructure of monasteries and schools, the simple fact that Greek speakers, Arabic speakers, and Latin speakers were living and working in close proximity under a single governmental authority made the work possible in ways that a more culturally homogeneous political environment could not have supported. Here again was Rollo's legacy expressing itself in forms he could never have imagined. The Norse exile who had preserved Frankish administrative structures in the Seine Valley had created a culture whose defining characteristic was the ability to integrate diverse elements into functional wholes. That characteristic, transmitted through 5 generations of Norman expansion, had produced in Sicily an environment where the accumulated knowledge of the ancient world could be recovered, translated, and disseminated to a Western Europe that was on the cusp of its own intellectual revolution. The chain of causation is long and tenuous, and it would be absurd to claim that Rollo caused the Renaissance, but it is not absurd to observe that the conditions Rollo created, the hybrid culture, the pragmatic adaptability, the institutional capacity for synthesis, contributed through their most distant and improbable expressions to the intellectual transformation that reshaped the Western world. The Norman story, viewed across its full geographic and chronological span, is ultimately a story about the consequences of cultural collision. What happened when a Norse exile with a war band settled on Frankish soil was not a conquest in the conventional sense. It was a fusion, a forced marriage of 2 civilizations that produced offspring neither parent could have predicted. The Normans were not Vikings who happened to speak French, and they were not Franks who happened to fight like Vikings. They were something genuinely unprecedented, a culture that had internalized the strengths of 2 traditions and that carried in its institutional DNA a capacity for further synthesis that expressed itself wherever the Normans went. In Normandy, they fused Norse and Frankish elements into a duchy of extraordinary military and administrative potency. In England, they fused Norman governance with Anglo-Saxon institutional traditions to create the most effectively administered state in medieval Europe. In Sicily, they fused Norman, Byzantine, and Islamic elements into a kingdom of unique cultural sophistication. In the Crusader states, they attempted the same synthesis under conditions that ultimately proved too challenging for the model to sustain. In Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, they introduced feudal institutions and administrative practices that reshaped the political landscapes of the Celtic world. Everywhere they went, the pattern repeated: arrive, adapt, absorb, synthesize, govern. The consistency of this pattern across such diverse environments suggests that it was not accidental, that it reflected something fundamental about the culture itself, something embedded so deeply in the Norman character that it expressed itself automatically, without conscious planning or deliberate policy. And the most plausible origin for that fundamental trait is the founding moment itself, the moment when Rollo, an exile with no homeland, chose to preserve rather than destroy the civilization he had conquered, to marry into it rather than dominate it from outside, to create something new rather than simply imposing something old. Every subsequent Norman achievement was, in a sense, a variation on that original theme. William the Conqueror preserving the English administrative system was Rollo preserving the Frankish county system. Roger II employing Muslim administrators in Palermo was Rollo employing Frankish officials in Rouen. Bohemond adapting feudal governance to the conditions of the Levant was Rollo adapting Norse chieftainship to the conditions of the Seine Valley. The scale changed, the geography changed, the specific civilizations in contact changed. But the underlying principle, the principle of pragmatic synthesis, of building the new from the best available elements of the old, remained constant across 150 years of Norman expansion and across a geographic range that stretched from the Atlantic to the Orontes. This principle, more than any specific battle or conquest, is Rollo's true legacy. It is the thread that connects the baptism in 911 to the Domesday Book in 1086, the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte to the Capella Palatina, the exile from the fjords to the constitutional traditions of the English-speaking world. It is the principle that transformed a Viking raider into a European founder and that made the Normans, for a brief and extraordinary period, the most creative and most consequential political force in the Western world. But legacies are never simple, and the Norman legacy least of all. The same culture that built cathedrals and law codes also conducted the harrying of the North. The same administrative genius that produced the Domesday Book also produced the systematic dispossession of an entire English ruling class. The same pragmatic adaptability that allowed the Normans to govern Muslim Sicily with tolerance also allowed them to conquer and colonize Ireland with brutality. The Norman achievement cannot be separated from the Norman violence, because they were expressions of the same fundamental capacity, the capacity to assess a situation with ruthless clarity, to determine what served one's interests, and to act accordingly without sentiment and without hesitation. Rollo himself embodied this duality as completely as any of his descendants. He was a man who burned monasteries and then rebuilt them. A man who terrorized the Seine Valley for decades and then governed it with something approaching justice. A man who accepted baptism as a political transaction and then endowed the church that baptized him with lands and revenues. A man who could not read or write, who worshipped gods that predated Christ by millennia, and who nonetheless created the conditions for one of the most literate, most architecturally innovative, and most legally sophisticated cultures in medieval Europe. The contradictions do not resolve, they are the story. And the story is not over. It continues in every courtroom that operates under common law, in every parliament that traces its ancestry to the English constitutional tradition, in every English sentence that contains a word derived from Norman French, in every castle ruin that stands on a hillside in England or Wales or Ireland or Sicily or the Levant. Mute testimony to a culture that was born in a river valley in northern France, when a Norse pirate and a Frankish king agreed to a deal that changed the world. The physical traces of the Norman world are scattered across an astonishing breadth of geography, and they speak, even in their silence, to the scale of what 5 generations built from the foundation Rollo laid. Walk through the narrow streets of the old quarter in Rouen, Rollo's capital, the city he sacked and then made the seat of his duchy, and you are walking through the palimpsest of a civilization that reinvented itself in the space of a lifetime. The great cathedral of Rouen, whose spire Monet would paint in every quality of light 8 centuries later, stands on the site where Rollo's baptism was commemorated, where his bones were interred, where the Norman dukes held court and received the homage of the vassals whose loyalty sustained their power. The cathedral is Gothic now, rebuilt and rebuilt again across the centuries in the evolving architectural styles of medieval and early modern France, but its foundations rest on the Norman Romanesque structures that Rollo's son and grandson commissioned, and beneath those foundations lie the ruins of the earlier church that the Vikings themselves destroyed. Cross the Channel to England, and the Norman presence is equally inescapable. The Tower of London, William's great stone keep planted on the north bank of the Thames within months of the conquest, enlarged and fortified by successive kings until it became the fortress complex that dominates the eastern approach to the city, is perhaps the single most potent symbol of what the Norman conquest meant in physical terms. It was not built to defend London, it was built to intimidate London. Its white limestone walls, visible from miles in every direction, in an age when most buildings were constructed of wood, announced in the most literal possible terms that a new power had arrived, and that its authority was backed by stone, mortar, and the men who garrisoned the battlements. The tower has served as a royal palace, a prison, a treasury, an armory, a menagerie, and an execution ground across 900 years of continuous use. It is the oldest continuously occupied fortification in Europe, and it was built by the descendants of a man who was born in a timber hall on a Norwegian fjord. Travel south from London to the ridge where Harold Godwinson made his last stand, and you will find Battle Abbey, the monastery that William ordered built on the exact spot where Harold fell, its high altar positioned, according to tradition, precisely where the last Anglo-Saxon king drew his final breath. The abbey was William's act of penance for the blood shed at Hastings, and it was simultaneously a statement of triumphant permanence, a Norman institution planted on the site of the Norman victory, its monks praying in perpetuity for the souls of the dead while the lands that funded their prayers were held by the conquerors who had created the need for those prayers in the first place. The abbey is a ruin now, dissolved by Henry VIII in the 16th century, its stones carried away for building material, its monastic community scattered. But the site itself retains a gravity that no amount of subsequent development has diminished. Stand on the ridge at sunset, look south toward the ground where the Norman cavalry charged uphill into the English shield wall, and the landscape still speaks of the day when the political destiny of the British Isles was decided by the clash of men whose ancestors had never imagined sharing a battlefield. In Durham, the great Norman cathedral rises above the River Wear like a ship of stone riding a green wave. Built between 1093 and 1133, it is the finest surviving example of Norman Romanesque architecture in England, and one of the finest examples of Romanesque architecture anywhere in Europe. Its massive cylindrical pillars, carved with geometric patterns that recall both Viking interlace and Roman decoration, support a nave of breathtaking proportions. The ribbed vaulting of the ceiling, and one of the earliest examples of this technique in European architecture, represents a structural innovation that anticipated the Gothic style by half a century. Durham Cathedral was built to awe, and it succeeds. It was built by a Norman bishop, William of Saint-Clair, using Norman masons, Norman engineering techniques, and the wealth extracted from a Norman-controlled English county. It was and remains a demonstration of what Norman civilization could produce when its resources were directed toward creation rather than conquest. In Sicily, the evidence is more complex and more beautiful. The Cathedral of Cefalù, begun by Roger II in 1131, combines a Norman Romanesque exterior, twin towers flanking a fortified facade that would not look out of place in Normandy itself, with an interior of Byzantine splendor. The great mosaic of Christ Pantocrator in the apse, his right hand raised in blessing, his expression simultaneously serene and stern, gazes down from a golden heaven onto a space that encapsulates the Norman-Sicilian synthesis in a single glance. The architecture is Western, the decoration is Eastern, the effect is neither. It is something that could only have been produced in the specific cultural conditions that the Normans created in the Mediterranean South. In Palermo, the Cappella Palatina remains the most concentrated expression of Norman multicultural ambition, but the city holds other treasures equally revealing. The Church of San Giovanni degli Eremiti, with its distinctive red domes that recall the mosques of North Africa, was built on the site of an earlier Islamic structure and incorporates elements of Islamic architecture so seamlessly that it is impossible to determine where the Muslim building ends and the Norman building begins. The Zisa Palace, its name derived from the Arabic Al-Aziz meaning the splendid, was built by William I of Sicily as a pleasure palace in the Arabic style, complete with fountains, gardens, and Macarna's ceilings that reproduce the aesthetic environment of a Fatimid royal residence. These buildings were not acts of cultural appropriation in the modern sense. They were expressions of a ruling class that genuinely inhabited multiple cultural worlds simultaneously, and that saw no contradiction in building a Christian chapel with an Islamic ceiling or a royal palace with an Arabic name. These physical traces, the castles, the cathedrals, the palaces, the monasteries, were the most visible elements of the Norman legacy, but the invisible elements are more consequential still. The legal traditions, the linguistic transformations, the administrative innovations, the constitutional principles that evolved from the particular conditions the Normans created. These are the true inheritance, the living legacy that continues to shape the world long after the last Norman castle has crumbled to its foundations. And at the root of all of it, beneath the castles and the cathedrals, beneath the common law and the English language, beneath the kingdoms of England and Sicily and the Principality of Antioch, beneath the Domesday Book and the Magna Carta and the constitutional traditions of the English-speaking world, lies a single decision made by a single man in a single moment of pragmatic calculation. Rollo stayed. He could have raided and left. He could have taken the silver and sailed home, except that he had no home, which is perhaps the point. The man who created the conditions for modern Europe was a man with no alternative, an exile who could not return, a warrior who could not retire, a father who needed to provide for a son in a world that offered no second chances. The decision to settle, to build, to preserve rather than destroy. It was not idealism. It was necessity transmuted by intelligence and patience and an instinct for permanence that set Rollo apart from every other Norse raider of his generation. The necessity produced Normandy. Normandy produced the Normans. The Normans produced the medieval world. And the medieval world, through channels of causation so long and so intricate that tracing them requires the work of lifetimes, produced the institutional framework within which the modern world was constructed. It is an extraordinary chain of consequence to hang from the neck of an illiterate Norse pirate who knelt in a Frankish church because a king he had terrorized for 3 decades offered him a deal he could not refuse. But the chain holds. Every link bears examination. And the weight of what it carries, the weight of empires, languages, legal systems, architectural traditions, and constitutional principles that touch the lives of billions of people who have never heard the name Rollo, is a testament to the most improbable truth in the history of the medieval West. The greatest dynasty in European history was founded by accident, by a man who was simply trying to survive. And yet to call it accident is to simplify what was, in truth, something far more interesting than either accident or design. It was adaptation. The same quality that had carried Rollo from the fjords to the Seine, the same quality that had carried his descendants from the Seine to the Thames, from the Thames to the Mediterranean, from the Mediterranean to the walls of Jerusalem. Adaptation is not planning. It does not require foresight or grand strategy or the ability to see centuries into the future. It requires only the willingness to look at the world as it actually is, to assess what is possible within the constraints of the moment, and to act with sufficient intelligence and sufficient ruthlessness to seize whatever opportunity the moment offers. This was the quality that defined the Normans, and it was the quality that makes their story so difficult to categorize in moral terms, because adaptation by its nature is indifferent to the categories that human beings use to organize their moral understanding. It is neither good nor evil. It is neither creative nor destructive. It is both simultaneously, depending on the circumstances to which it responds and the opportunities it perceives. The same adaptive intelligence that led Rollo to preserve Frankish institutions led William to order the harrying of the North. The same pragmatic flexibility that allowed Roger to govern Muslim Sicily with tolerance allowed the Norman lords of Ireland to dispossess the native Irish aristocracy with impunity. The Normans did not choose between creation and destruction. They chose whichever served the moment, and they executed both with equal competence. This is what makes the Norman legacy so resistant to the kind of triumphalist or condemnatory narratives that historical legacies typically attract. The temptation is always to simplify, to celebrate the cathedrals and ignore the massacres, or to condemn the conquests and ignore the institutions. But the Norman story refuses simplification, because the cathedrals and the massacres were produced by the same culture, the same values, the same fundamental orientation toward the world. You cannot have the common law without the conquest that created the conditions for its development. You cannot have the conquest without the military culture that made it possible. You cannot have the military culture without the hybrid civilization that Rollo founded. And you cannot have the hybrid civilization without the violence that brought a Norse warband to the banks of the Seine in the first place. The chain is unbreakable because every link is fused to the next by the heat of historical causation, and no amount of retrospective moral sorting can separate the elements we wish to celebrate from the elements we wish to condemn. They are the same elements expressed in different contexts, producing different outcomes that we judge differently because our moral frameworks are built for evaluating individual actions, not civilizational trajectories. This is not moral relativism. The harrying of the North was an atrocity. The dispossession of the English aristocracy was an injustice. The conquest and colonization of Ireland produced suffering that persisted for centuries, These things can be stated plainly and without qualification. But stating them plainly does not require us to pretend that the culture that produced them was uniquely or exceptionally evil. Every medieval civilization, Anglo-Saxon, Frankish, Byzantine, Islamic, Norse, was capable of comparable violence when circumstances demanded or permitted it. What made the Normans distinctive was not their capacity for violence, but their capacity for construction. The ability to build durable institutions in the aftermath of conquest, to create political entities that outlasted the generation that founded them, to leave behind not just ruins but functioning states. And this brings us back inevitably to the question of what Rollo actually achieved and what it means to call him the accidental founder of modern Europe. The claim rests on a specific argument, and the argument has two parts. The first part is institutional. The legal, administrative, and constitutional traditions of the English-speaking world, the common law, parliamentary government, the concept of individual rights enforceable against the state, developed within the specific historical conditions created by the Norman conquest of England. Those conditions included the fusion of Norman centralizing governance with English customary legal traditions, the creation of a powerful monarchy constrained by the feudal obligations it had imposed on its own vassals, and the development of institutional mechanisms, parliament, the royal courts, the jury system, that emerged from the ongoing negotiation between royal authority and baronial privilege. These institutions were carried across the Atlantic by English colonists, embedded in the founding documents of the United States and transmitted through the British Empire to legal systems across the globe. The argument that the Norman conquest was a necessary condition for the development of these institutions is not a speculative claim. It is a statement about the historical record supported by 9 centuries of documented institutional evolution. The second part of the argument is cultural. The Norman conquest transformed the English language from a purely Germanic tongue into the hybrid Germanic Romance language that would become, through the expansion of British and later American power, the dominant language of global communication. The Norman conquest introduced to England the feudal land law, the castle, the cathedral, the monastery, and the administrative practices that shaped English society for centuries. The Norman conquest connected England to continental European culture in ways that Anglo-Saxon insularity had resisted, creating a kingdom that was simultaneously Atlantic and European, that looked both west and east, and that would eventually leverage this dual orientation into a global empire of unprecedented scope. The argument that all of this traces back to Rollo is not that Rollo foresaw or intended any of it. It is that Rollo created the initial conditions, the hybrid Norse-Frankish culture, the territorial base, the dynasty, the institutional traditions from which everything else followed. Without Rollo's settlement on the Seine, there is no Normandy. Without Normandy, there is no Norman conquest. Without the Norman conquest, the development of English law, English language, English governance, and English culture follows a fundamentally different trajectory. One that we cannot predict, but that would certainly not have produced the specific institutional and linguistic outcomes that have shaped the modern world. This is a strong claim, and it requires a caveat. Counterfactual history, the attempt to determine what would have happened if a particular event had not occurred, is inherently speculative. We cannot know what England would have become without the Norman conquest any more than we can know what Francia would have become without Rollo's settlement. It is entirely possible that the Anglo-Saxon kingdom, left to its own devices, would have developed legal and administrative institutions of comparable sophistication. It is possible that the English language would have evolved in ways that produced a different but equally capable vehicle for global communication. It is possible that the institutional foundations of the modern democratic world would have been laid by someone else, somewhere else, through processes entirely unrelated to anything that happened on the banks of the Epte in 9/11, but possibility is not probability. And the fact remains that these things did not happen some other way. They happened the way they happened, through the specific chain of causation that runs from Rollo's settlement through the Norman conquest to the constitutional traditions of the English-speaking world. To acknowledge this chain is not to celebrate it or to condemn it. It is simply to recognize that history, unlike fiction, does not offer alternative endings, and that the world we inhabit was shaped by specific events, specific decisions, and specific individuals whose actions, however motivated, produced consequences that extended far beyond anything they could have imagined. Rollo was one of those individuals, not the most important, not the most consequential in isolation, but the one who stood at the beginning of a particular chain of causation that would prove, over a millennium, to be among the most significant in the history of the Western world. The twilight years of that chain's direct Norman expression deserve their own reckoning, because the story of the Normans is not only a story of expansion and synthesis, it is also a story of dissolution, of a culture that was so successful at absorbing other civilizations that it eventually absorbed itself. The process began in Normandy itself, where the Norse identity that had defined Rollo's warband faded with a speed that astonished contemporaries and has fascinated historians ever since. The linguistic evidence is the most concrete measure. Old Norse place names in Normandy, concentrated in the eastern regions closest to Rollo's original settlement, preserve a record of the initial Norse presence. Names ending in tot, from the Old Norse toft, meaning a farmstead, beck, from becker, meaning a stream, dala, from dalar, meaning a valley. These are scattered across the map of eastern Normandy, a linguistic geology that reveals the Norse settlement layer beneath the French surface. The Cotentin Peninsula and the Channel Islands preserve an even denser concentration of Norse toponyms, reflecting the later wave of Norse settlement that followed the expansion of the duchy westward. But these place names are fossils. They are the remnants of a language that ceased to be spoken within 2 to 3 generations of the initial settlement, by the time of Richard the Fearless, Rollo's grandson. The Norse language had essentially disappeared from Norman daily life, replaced entirely by the Romance dialect that would evolve into Norman French. The speed of this linguistic shift is remarkable by any historical standard. It took the Anglo-Saxons centuries to absorb the linguistic influence of the Scandinavian settlements in eastern England. It took the Norse settlers of Iceland generations to develop their own distinctive literary tradition from the Old Norse base. The Norman linguistic transformation happened in roughly 50 years, a single human lifetime. And it was so complete that by the mid-10th century, the Norman dukes had to send their sons to Bayeux in the western part of the duchy to learn the Norse language that their great-grandfather had spoken as his native tongue. This linguistic dissolution was accompanied by a broader cultural transformation that eventually rendered the term Norman meaningless as an ethnic designation and meaningful only as a political and cultural identity. The Normans of the 11th century were not an ethnic group in any meaningful sense. They were a political community, a collection of families of diverse Norse, Frankish, Breton, Flemish, and other origins who shared a common territory, a common loyalty to the ducal house, and a common set of cultural values that had emerged from the hybrid environment of the Seine Valley. The Normanness that defined them was not a matter of blood. It was a matter of belonging, of participation in the institutions, the military culture, the religious life, and the political community that the duchy had created. This is why the Normans were able to assimilate so rapidly into the diverse civilizations they conquered. They were not defending an ethnic identity that required preservation. They were deploying a cultural toolkit that required application. The toolkit included specific skills: military organization, administrative management, architectural engineering, legal codification, and specific values: pragmatism, adaptability, loyalty to the lordship structure, a particular blend of piety and ruthlessness. But it did not include a commitment to ethnic purity or cultural separatism that would have prevented the kind of deep integration that the Normans achieved wherever they settled. In England, the process of Norman dissolution into the broader English population took longer than it had taken in Normandy, but the trajectory was the same. The Norman aristocracy that William installed in England maintained its distinctive identity for roughly a century and a half after the conquest. During this period, the ruling class spoke Norman French, maintained ties to Normandy, and understood itself as a conquering elite distinct from the English population it governed. but the pressure of daily life, the need to communicate with English-speaking tenants, the intermarriage with English families that accelerated after the first generation, the gradual loss of Norman lands that accompanied the political separation of England and Normandy, eroded the boundaries with relentless efficiency. The loss of Normandy itself was the decisive moment. In 1204, King John of England, great-great-grandson of William the Conqueror, lost the Duchy of Normandy to King Philip Augustus of France. The military defeat was comprehensive and humiliating. Philip's armies overran the duchy in a single campaign season, capturing the great castle of Château Gaillard, the fortress that Richard the Lionheart had built on the Seine and declared impregnable after a siege of 6 months. John, whose military incompetence would earn him a historical reputation even worse than his political one, made only feeble efforts to recover the lost territory before accepting its loss as permanent. The consequences for the Norman identity in England were immediate and profound. For a century and a half, the Norman aristocracy of England had been a cross-channel elite, holding lands in both England and Normandy, owing allegiance to both the English crown and the French crown for different portions of their estates. The loss of Normandy forced them to choose. Most chose England. They held more land there. The English administrative system was more efficient at protecting their interests, and the practical difficulties of maintaining estates on both sides of the Channel had been growing for decades. But in choosing England, they cut the umbilical cord that had connected them to their Norman origins. They became English, not overnight, not without resistance. But inevitably, as the generation that remembered Normandy gave way to the generation that had never seen it, the Norman aristocracy of England completed the transformation that Rollo's warband had begun in the Seine Valley 2 centuries earlier. They absorbed into the civilization they had conquered. They became what they had come to rule. The linguistic evidence marks the transition with precision. In the mid-13th century, the English chronicler Matthew Paris recorded that the English baronage could no longer speak French fluently, that the language of the conquerors had become a second language, learned in schools rather than absorbed in childhood, used for official purposes, but no longer the native tongue of the ruling class. By the 14th century, English had re-emerged as the language of Parliament, the law courts, and the royal court. In 1362, the Statute of Pleading required that all court proceedings be conducted in English rather than French, a legal recognition of a linguistic reality that had been established for decades. In 1399, when Henry IV claimed the English throne, he did so in English. The first English king since Harold Godwinson, 333 years earlier, to address his people in their own language. The Norman chapter was closing. The culture that had conquered England, Sicily, southern Italy, Antioch, and half the Celtic world was dissolving into the civilizations it had transformed, leaving behind not a people but a legacy. A set of institutions, languages, architectural traditions, legal principles, and cultural habits so deeply embedded in the societies that had absorbed them that they could no longer be identified as foreign imports. They had become native, they had become invisible, they had become, in the most literal sense, the furniture of everyday life, so familiar, so integral to the functioning of the societies they shaped, that their origin in a 9th century Viking settlement on the banks of the Seine had been entirely forgotten. This is the final irony of the Norman story, and it is perhaps the deepest. The culture that was defined by its ability to absorb others was itself absorbed so completely that its very existence became a matter of specialist historical knowledge rather than common cultural memory. Ask an English person today about the origins of their legal system, their language, their parliamentary traditions, their castles, their cathedrals, and they will offer answers that invoke English history, English culture, English ingenuity, without recognizing that each of these things bears the imprint of a civilization that arrived from across the Channel in 1066 and that traced its own origins to a Norse warband that arrived from across the North Sea a century and a half before that. The Normans disappeared into their own success. They built so well, adapted so completely, integrated so thoroughly, that the structures they created no longer bore any visible trace of their builders. The common law does not announce itself as a Norman creation. The English language does not label its French-derived vocabulary with certificates of origin. The castles and cathedrals do not explain to the tourists who visit them that they were built by the descendants of Vikings who had been terrorizing the coast of France a few generations before they picked up their chisels and their plumb lines. But the evidence is there for anyone who cares to look. It is there in every English courtroom where a jury sits in judgment. It is there in every act of parliament that traces its procedural ancestry to the assemblies that the Normans convened. It is there in every English word that derives from French: authority, justice, liberty, sovereignty, parliament, government, nation, people. It is there in the stone walls of Durham Cathedral, in the White Tower, in the ruins of Chateau Gaillard. It is there in the legal systems of the United States, Canada, Australia, India, and every other nation that inherited the common law tradition. It is there in the very concept of constitutional governance, the idea that power must be exercised within a framework of law and custom that constrains even the most powerful, an idea that was forged in the specific conditions created by the Norman conquest and the centuries of negotiation that followed it. And it is there, most quietly and most powerfully, in the name itself: Normandy, the land of the Northmen, the name that a Frankish king assigned to the territory he had given to a Norse pirate, and that the territory has carried for 1,100 years, outlasting every dynasty that governed it, every army that marched through it, every political reorganization that redrew the maps of France. The name endures because the thing it names endures, not as a political entity, not as a center of power, but as a landscape shaped by the decisions of men and women who lived 11 centuries ago and whose choices, for good and ill, created the world in which we live. The beaches of Normandy entered the global imagination again in the 20th century, in a context that Rollo could never have conceived, but that carried, in its deepest structural logic, an echo of his own story. On the 6th of June 1944, an Allied force crossed the English Channel in the opposite direction from William's Crossing and landed on the beaches of the Norman coast. The invasion was the largest amphibious military operation in human history. Over 150,000 troops supported by 5,000 ships and 11,000 aircraft, assaulting a fortified coastline defended by one of the most powerful military machines the world had ever known. The beaches where they landed, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword, lie within miles of the territory that Rollo received in the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte. The soldiers who stormed those beaches came from nations whose legal systems, whose languages, whose political institutions had all been shaped, in ways they could not have articulated and almost certainly did not know, by the events that had unfolded on this same coastline 1,000 years before. The parallel is not exact. History does not repeat itself with the precision that aphorism suggests, but the resonance is real, and it is worth pausing over. A military force assembled across the Channel, crossing the water to establish a beachhead on the Norman coast, fighting to impose a new political order on a territory held by a hostile power. The structural skeleton of the D-Day invasion is, in its broadest outlines, the structural skeleton of the Norman conquest played in reverse. The descendants of the civilization that William had created were returning to the land where his civilization had been born, fighting to liberate it from an occupier whose vision of European order was the antithesis of everything the Norman English constitutional tradition represented. The soldiers who landed on those beaches did not think of themselves as heirs of the Normans. They thought of themselves as Americans, Canadians, British, and Free French fighting to defeat fascism, and they were right. But they were also, in ways that the urgency of the moment left no time to contemplate, the products of a civilizational tradition that had begun when a Norse exile and a Frankish king stood on the banks of a river and negotiated a deal that would echo across a millennium. The common law that the American soldiers had grown up under, the parliamentary democracy that the British soldiers were fighting to preserve, the French Republic whose liberation was the invasion's ultimate purpose, All of these things carried deep in their institutional DNA the imprint of the Norman experiment. The cemetery at Consolidation overlooking Omaha Beach holds the remains of over 9,000 American soldiers who died in the invasion and the campaign that followed. The white marble crosses and stars of David stand in rows of geometric perfection, aligned with a precision that speaks to something deeper than military discipline, a need to impose order on the chaos of violent death, to insist that the sacrifice had meaning, that the individuals who made it were part of something larger than themselves. The cemetery looks out over the beach where they fell, and beyond the beach, over the gray waters of the channel that Rollo's longships crossed 11 centuries before, and beyond the channel, toward the English coast where William assembled his fleet in 1066, and beyond the coast, toward the island whose legal and political traditions those soldiers had been raised to defend. The view from Consolidation encompasses, in a single sweep of the eye, the full geographic span of the Norman story. From the Norman coast to the English shore, from the territory Rollo claimed to the kingdom William conquered, from the origin of a civilization to the defense of its descendants. It is a view that no single moment in history can encompass, because the history it contains is too long and too dense and too contradictory for any single perspective to hold. But it is a view that rewards contemplation, because it reminds us that the world we inhabit did not spring into existence fully formed. It was built, layer upon layer, decision upon decision, consequence upon consequence, by men and women whose names we have mostly forgotten and whose choices we have mostly ceased to recognize as choices at all. Rollo's choice, the choice to stay, to settle, to build, was one of those decisions. It was made in a specific place at a specific time by a specific man operating under specific constraints. It was not a grand gesture. It was not a vision of the future. It was a pragmatic calculation by an aging warrior who needed land and who accepted the terms that were offered. But pragmatic calculations made at the right moment by the right person in the right place have a way of outlasting the grandest visions and the most deliberate plans. They embed themselves in the fabric of subsequent events so deeply that they become invisible, structural elements of a civilization that no one remembers building but that everyone inhabits. This is what Rollo built, not a kingdom, not an empire, not even in the conventional sense a civilization. He built a pattern, a way of encountering the world that proved so effective, so adaptable, so inexhaustibly productive that it outlived every specific form it took and embedded itself in the foundations of societies that no longer remember its name. And the pattern, stripped to its essence, was breathtakingly simple. Arrive somewhere new. Pay attention to what already works. Keep it. Improve it. Make it yours. Defend it as if you built it from nothing, because in a sense you did. The act of synthesis is itself an act of creation, and the thing that emerges from the fusion of two traditions is not a compromise between them, but something neither could have produced alone. This is what separates Rollo from the other great figures of the Viking Age, and it is what makes his story so much harder to tell than theirs. The sagas remember the warriors, the men who burned, conquered, explored, and died in ways that lend themselves to narrative drama. Ragnar Lothbrok, whether he existed as a single historical figure or as a composite of several, is remembered because his story is violent and vivid and satisfyingly tragic. Harold Hardrada is remembered because he fought his way across half the known world and died with an arrow in his throat at Stamford Bridge, the last great Viking warrior king brought down in the act of reaching for one more crown. Leif Erikson is remembered because he crossed an ocean and touched a continent that Europe would not rediscover for another 5 centuries. Rollo is not remembered in the same way, and the reason is instructive. His achievement was not dramatic. It was procedural. He did not discover a continent or die gloriously in battle or inspire saga poets to compose verses about his exploits. He negotiated a land deal. He accepted a baptism. He married a local woman. He enforced property rights. He defended his borders. He grew old and died in his bed in a city he had once sacked, surrounded by the hybrid civilization he had spent 4 decades assembling from the wreckage of 2 worlds that had been trying to destroy each other. There is no saga in this. There is no moment of transcendent heroism or beautiful catastrophe. There's only the slow, unglamorous, profoundly consequential work of building something that lasts. And the irony that the things which last are precisely the things that resist the narrative structures through which human beings prefer to understand their past. We remember the battles because battles have beginnings, middles, and ends. We remember the voyages because voyages have departures and arrivals. We remember the deaths because deaths are final and therefore meaningful in a way that ongoing processes are not. But the ongoing processes, the institutional evolution, the cultural synthesis, the gradual accumulation of legal precedent and administrative practice are what actually shape the world. They are the deep currents beneath the surface drama, and they are almost always invisible to the people living through them. Rollo was invisible to himself. He did not know he was founding a dynasty. He did not know he was creating a culture. He did not know that the administrative decisions he made in the first decades of his rule, preserving the county system, enforcing property law, encouraging intermarriage, were laying the foundations for a civilizational tradition that would span continents and centuries. He knew he was surviving. He knew he was providing for his son. He knew he was managing a volatile territory full of resentful Franks and restless Norsemen, and that any mistake could cost him everything he had spent 30 years earning. The gap between what Rollo knew and what Rollo caused is the central mystery of his story. And it is a mystery that admits no resolution because it is, at bottom, a mystery about the nature of historical causation itself. How do individual decisions made in specific moments for specific reasons aggregate into civilizational outcomes that no one planned or foresaw? How does a land deal become a legal system? How does a forced baptism become a cathedral-building tradition? How does a policy of intermarriage become a language? The answers to these questions are not found in Rollo's biography. They are found in the centuries that followed his death, in the long, patient, unnarratable process by which small decisions compound into large consequences and pragmatic calculations harden into permanent structures. But if the answers lie in the centuries after Rollo, the questions begin with him. They begin on the banks of the Epte in the autumn of 911 when 2 men, one a king whose kingdom was disintegrating, the other a pirate whose war band was his only country, looked across a river and saw not an enemy, but an opportunity. Charles the Simple saw a buffer. Rollo saw a future. Neither saw what they were actually creating, which was a template for civilizational construction that would be applied with variations across half the known world by men who had never heard of either of them. The template had a cost, and the cost was not distributed equally. The Frankish peasants who watched their tormentors become their lords paid a cost that no treaty compensated. The English thanes who lost their lands to Norman barons paid a cost that no legal system remedied. The Welsh and Irish and Scottish communities that were restructured along Norman feudal lines paid a cost that persisted for centuries. The Muslim population of Sicily, which flourished under early Norman rule, was gradually marginalized as the Norman kingdom became more conventionally Christian, and was eventually expelled entirely under the Hohenstaufen and Angevin rulers who inherited the Norman throne. The indigenous populations of every territory the Normans touched paid some version of the same price. The price of being absorbed into someone else's synthesis, of having their institutions preserved but redirected, their cultures respected but subordinated, their futures shaped by decisions in which they had no voice. This is the shadow that falls across every celebration of Norman achievement, and it is a shadow that honest historical accounting cannot dispel. The Norman genius for synthesis was also a genius for appropriation. The Norman talent for preserving institutions was also a talent for capturing them. The Norman willingness to adapt was also a willingness to impose adaptation on others, whether they wished to be adapted or not. The line between cultural flexibility and cultural imperialism is drawn by the people on the receiving end, and the Norman record, viewed from that perspective, is considerably less admirable than it appears from the perspective of the castles and cathedrals, But the shadow does not negate the achievement. It complicates it. It demands that the achievement be understood not as a triumph, but as a transaction, one in which extraordinary gains were purchased at extraordinary cost, and in which the gains and the costs were borne by different people. The common law is real. The parliamentary tradition is real. The English language, with its extraordinary range and flexibility, is real. The architectural heritage, the administrative innovations, the legal principles that underpin democratic governance across the English-speaking world, all of these are real, and all of them trace their origins through chains of causation that scholarship can document with considerable precision to the events set in motion by Rollo's settlement on the Seine. But the harrying of the North is also real. The dispossession of the English aristocracy is also real. The centuries of colonial domination in Ireland and Wales are also real. And these things trace their origins through equally documentable chains of causation to the same events and the same culture. The Norman legacy is not a ledger that can be balanced. It is a web of consequences so vast and so entangled that any attempt to render a final moral verdict on it reveals more about the person rendering the verdict than about the thing itself. What can be said, what must be said, because it is simply true, is that the world would be unrecognizably different without it. Whether it would be better or worse is a question that history cannot answer, because history does not deal in alternatives. It deals in what happened, and what happened was that a Norse exile settled on a French river and set in motion a chain of events that reshaped the Western world. The man himself remains elusive. After 11 centuries, after the patient work of generations of scholars sifting through Dudo's propaganda and Flottard's terse entries and Snorri's distant memories, we still cannot say with certainty when Rollo was born, where exactly he came from, what he looked like beyond the persistent tradition of extraordinary size, what he believed about the gods he abandoned and the God he adopted, what he felt when he knelt in that church and let the holy water wash over a head that had planned the sacking of the very monasteries that now blessed him. The sources give us actions, they do not give us the man behind them. And perhaps this is appropriate. Perhaps the elusiveness of Rollo the individual is the final expression of the culture he created. A culture that valued results over identity, that cared more about what a man did than who he was, that measured worth not by origin, but by outcome. The Normans did not build monuments to ethnic purity. They built monuments to power. Effective, adaptive, institutional power that outlasted the individuals who wielded it and the ethnic categories that originally defined them. Rollo would have understood this instinctively because it was the logic of the Norse warband translated into the grammar of territorial governance. In the warband, a man's value was determined by his contribution to the group's survival and success. His ancestry mattered less than his axe arm. His birth mattered less than his loyalty. What mattered was what he could do, and whether what he could do served the collective interest. This was the ethic that Rollo brought to the Seine Valley, and it was the ethic that his descendants carried across Europe and into the Levant. It was an ethic of radical pragmatism, stripped of sentiment, focused with crystalline clarity on the question that every leader of a vulnerable community must answer. What works? Not what is right in the abstract. Not what is sanctioned by tradition. Not what flatters our self-image or confirms our prejudices. What works, what keeps us alive, what makes us strong, what allows us to build something that will outlast the current crisis and provide a foundation for whatever comes next. The ethic has its limits. It can justify terrible things when the definition of what works is controlled by those with the power to impose their definition on others. It can produce a coldness, a transactional ruthlessness that is repellent when viewed from the perspective of its victims. It can mistake efficiency for wisdom and durability for justice. All of these failings are visible in the Norman record, and all of them are worth naming plainly. But the ethic also produced Durham Cathedral. It produced the Domesday Book. It produced the Capella Palatina. It produced the common law. It produced a language spoken by 2 billion people. It produced constitutional principles that, however imperfectly realized in practice, have provided the framework for the most stable and prosperous societies in human history. These things did not emerge from nowhere. They emerged from specific historical conditions created by specific decisions made by specific people operating under specific constraints. And the first of those people, the one who made the first of those decisions, the one who created the initial conditions from which everything else followed, was a man whose name the sources cannot even agree on. Rollo. Rolf. The famous wolf. The man too large for any horse. The exile who could not go home, and who, in the impossibility of return, discovered the possibility of something unprecedented. He did not choose to create Normandy, he chose to survive, and Normandy was what survival required. He did not choose to found a dynasty, he chose to protect his son, and a dynasty was what protection produced. He did not choose to reshape Europe. He chose to hold a small territory on a French river, and Europe was reshaped by the consequences of that holding. The smallness of the original choice and the vastness of its consequences. This is the essential truth of Rollo's story, and it is a truth that extends far beyond the medieval period and far beyond the Norman experience. It is a truth about history itself, about the way that human civilization is constructed not through grand designs but through the accumulation of pragmatic decisions, each one reasonable in its own moment, each one producing consequences that exceed anything its maker could have foreseen. The architects of the modern world are not, for the most part, the visionaries and prophets whose names fill the histories. They are the Rollos, the practical men and women who solved the problem in front of them and inadvertently created the conditions for everything that followed. There is a tomb in the cathedral at Rouen. It is not the original. The cathedral has been rebuilt multiple times since Rollo's burial, and whatever marked his resting place in the 10th century has long since been replaced, relocated, or lost. The current monument is a later construction, a stone effigy that tells us nothing reliable about the man it commemorates. But it is there. It marks a place. It says, "Here lay a man who mattered, though the full measure of his mattering took 1,000 years to become visible." The cathedral is quiet in the late afternoon. The light comes through the high windows at an angle that catches the dust motes and makes them glow, and the stone walls hold a coolness that seems to belong to a different season than the one outside. Tourists pass through, glancing at the tomb without stopping, guidebooks in hand, moving toward the more famous features of the building. The stained glass, the astronomical clock, the chapel where Richard the Lionheart's heart is interred in a silver casket. Rollo's tomb does not attract crowds. It is not one of the cathedral's highlights. It is simply there, a stone rectangle in a side chapel, carrying a name that means nothing to most of the people who walk past it. This anonymity is its own kind of monument. The man who set in motion the chain of events that produced the English language, the common law, the parliamentary tradition, and the constitutional principles that govern the lives of billions of people rests in a church where most visitors do not know his name. The foundations he laid are so deep and so thoroughly incorporated into the structures built upon them that they have become invisible, not forgotten exactly, but subsumed, absorbed into the fabric of the present so completely that the present no longer recognizes them as the work of any particular past. This is the fate of all founders, perhaps. The more successful the foundation, the less visible it becomes. A building whose foundations are sound does not draw attention to its foundations. A legal system that functions does not advertise its origins. A language that works, that allows its speakers to think, to argue, to love, to govern, to create, does not pause to acknowledge the historical accidents that made it what it is. The Norman conquest gave English 30% of its vocabulary, but no English speaker in the act of speaking thinks about the Normans. The common law shapes the daily lives of billions of people, but no litigant in the act of seeking justice reflects on the administrative decisions of a duke who lived 11 centuries ago. The parliamentary tradition structures governance across the democratic world, but no legislator, in the act of legislating, traces the procedural chain back to the feudal assemblies that emerged from the conditions created by the Norman conquest. The invisibility is complete. The legacy is total. And the man at the origin of both lies beneath the stones of a French cathedral, unnamed by the tourists who pass his tomb, unknown to the billions whose lives his decisions shaped, remembered only by the specialists who study the medieval period, and by the landscape itself. The green fields and gray rivers of Normandy, the land of the Northmen, the territory that a desperate Frankish king handed to a Norse pirate in the hope that the pirate might prove more reliable than the kingdom's own defenses. The hope was justified. The pirate proved reliable, and the consequences of his reliability are the world we live in. Outside the cathedral, the streets of Rouen carry on with the business of a modern French city. Cars move through intersections that were once the sites of Norse market stalls. Shops occupy buildings whose foundations date to the period of Norman reconstruction after the Viking raids. The Seine flows past the city as it has always flowed, broad and gray and patient, carrying the same water to the same sea that Rollo's longships navigated when they first appeared around the bend of the river, and the monks of the valley knew that everything was about to change. The river does not remember. Rivers never do. But the land remembers, in the way that land always remembers, through the names it carries, and the shapes it holds, and the institutions that grow from its soil like the crops that have grown there since before the Northmen came. Normandy remembers Rollo not in monuments or celebrations, but in the simple fact of its own existence, in the fact that a region of northern France bears a Norse name, that a French cathedral holds a Viking's bones, that the fields along the lower Seine produce their harvests in a landscape whose political and cultural contours were shaped a millennium ago by a man who arrived as a destroyer and departed as a founder. The story ends where it began, in a small stone church near the river Epte, on a gray autumn morning with a giant on his knees. The holy water runs over his bowed head. The bishop speaks the Latin words of baptism, and the man who has spent 30 years burning churches submits to the rites of the faith he has terrorized. His warriors watch from the shadows. The Frankish nobles watch from their places of honor. Charles the Simple watches from his throne, calculating the odds, hoping that this arrangement, this desperate, unprecedented, possibly insane arrangement, will hold long enough to give his broken kingdom a chance to recover. None of them can see what is coming. Not the king, not the bishop, not the warriors in the shadows, not even the giant on his knees who is thinking perhaps of the land he has been promised, of the son who will inherit it, of the farm he will never have to raid again because he will own one instead. He is thinking of survival. He is thinking of the next season, the next harvest, the next threat from the sea. He is thinking the small thoughts that pragmatic men think when they have secured a deal and are ready to begin the work of making it pay. He is not thinking about England. He is not thinking about Sicily. He is not thinking about common law or parliamentary government or the English language or the constitutional traditions of nations that do not yet exist on continents that have not yet been discovered by the civilization he is joining. He is not thinking about cathedrals or castles or the Bayeux Tapestry or the Domesday Book or the Magna Carta or the beaches of Normandy in June of 1944. He is not thinking about any of the things that his decision will create because the future is not available to the people who create it. It is available only to the people who inherit it, and they will inherit it so completely that they will forget it was ever created at all. The water runs, the words are spoken. The giant rises from his knees, taller than every man in the church, and walks out into the gray Norman light to begin the work that will, without his knowledge, without his intention, without the faintest glimmer of prophecy or design, build the world. He has no idea. And that perhaps is the most extraordinary thing about him. Not the battles, not the sieges, not the treaty or the territory or the dynasty. The most extraordinary thing about Rollo is that he did all of it. All of it. Every consequence, every institution, every language, every law, without knowing what he was doing. He was just trying to survive, and he built the world by accident. The river runs on, the land endures, the names remain, and somewhere beneath the stones of Rouen, in the city he sacked and then saved and then made the capital of something that would outlast every empire of his age, the giant sleeps. He has been sleeping for 1100 years. The world he made has not yet finished waking up.